imagine for a second that you're looking into a historical figure, right?
Yeah.
And his birth year is just completely unknown. I mean, nobody wrote it down.
Right, totally blank.
Yeah, his personal biographical record is just this messy pile of educated guesses, typos, and basically historical dead ends.
Which is pretty wild for someone so influential.
Exactly. And on top of that, the defining book he wrote, like his absolute masterwork, it was so dense and so poorly organized and just so incredibly confusing that even his most loyal top-tier followers complained it was practically unreadable.
Yeah, they literally went on the record to complain about it.
Right, so you would think, a guy like that would just be a footnote in history, just some dusty ghost in the archives.
You definitely assume he'd fade into total obscurity within, a generation.
But he didn't. Instead, that enigmatic guy with the unreadable book ended up writing the theological operating system for the entire Ottoman Empire.
It's honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in intellectual history.
It really is. I mean, his ideas became the mandatory institutionalized worldview for literally hundreds of millions of people.
Across Eastern Europe, the Arab world, Persia, India.
Yeah, and that framework is still heavily influencing the world today.
How does a localized, highly complex, almost impenetrable philosophical system scale up to become a global monopoly?
That is exactly what we are plunging into today. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
I am so glad you could join us because we are embarking on a massive historical and ideological journey. We're going to explore the origins, the intense literature, and the core doctrines of the Maturidia.
Right, the Maturidi theological school of Islam.
Exactly. And to really do this justice, we need to set the table, so to speak.
Yeah, we absolutely need to understand the specific lens we're looking through today.
Right, because the stack of sources we're drawing from for this deep dive is a very specific collection of theological and historical critiques.
We need to be totally upfront about this with you. We are not just reading from some neutral, objective Wikipedia page here.
No, not at all. These sources present a highly critical, highly specific theological perspective.
They are actively evaluating and honestly dismantling the Maturidi school.
Yeah, they're primarily measuring its beliefs against those of the Salaf.
Let's define that term right away, actually, because it's the benchmark for everything we're about to discuss today.
To go for it.
So when the sources say the Salaf, they are referring to the early generations of Muslims, like the first 3 generations following the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
In the eyes of our critical sources, the Salaf represent the gold standard. They represent the pure, straightforward practice of Islam.
Basically, the original blueprint.
Exactly. The blueprint before foreign ideas, specifically Greek philosophy and complex logical debates, sort of entered the bloodstream of the Islamic world.
So our sources are basically looking at the Maturidi school and saying, how does this highly philosophical system stack up against that simple original blueprint?
And usually their answer is it doesn't.
Right. But our job here is not to referee that theological debate.
No, we aren't taking sides.
And we certainly aren't endorsing the viewpoints of the critics or the targets.
We are just your guides.
Exactly. We are going to impartially unpack the history, the claims, and the mechanics of these ideas so that you can understand this massive ideological battlefield.
And for today's deep dive, we are focusing exclusively on the foundational era.
Yeah, just the first roughly 16% of our massive source material.
We're going to unpack the story of that enigmatic founder, dig through his controversial library, and break down his core beliefs.
And finally, trace how his local school in the city of Samarkand grew to dominate the world.
So let's start with the man himself, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi.
We are in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, right?
Correct. Geographically, we're in Samarkand, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan.
Historically, this area was known as Transoxiana, or the land beyond the river.
It's a great name.
It really is. But what is the vibe of Samarkand at this time? Because I feel like context is everything here.
Oh, context is absolutely everything. Samarkand wasn't some quiet, isolated village. It was a massive hub on the Silk Road.
So, lots of trade, lots of movement.
Exactly. It was a frontier territory where different cultures, religions, and philosophical systems were constantly colliding.
You had Persian influences, right?
Persian influences, remnants of ancient Greek thought filtering through, and a rapidly expanding Islamic empire trying to consolidate its theology.
Right. So in that environment, you don't just get to say, believe this because I said so.
No, not at all. You have to defend your beliefs against highly trained debaters.
And al-Maturidi was completely built for that environment.
He really was.
I mean, the historical texts refer to him with these sweeping, majestic titles like Imam of Guidance, Standard of Guidance, Corrector of the Beliefs of Muslims.
Quite the resume.
Yeah, and he was a follower of the Hanafi school of jurisprudence.
Let's pause on Hanafi for a second.
Sure.
In Sunni Islam, there are 4 major schools of jurisprudence, which is essentially the methodology for deriving legal rulings.
Right, the legal frameworks.
The Hanafi school, founded by Abu Hanifa, was famously known for its reliance on reason, logic, and deductive analogy.
Especially compared to other schools that were strictly tethered to literal textual traditions, right?
Exactly. So al-Maturidi is coming from a background that already highly values human intellect and logical deduction.
And he really needed that logic because he was stepping into the ring against some serious heavy hitters.
Oh, definitely.
Specifically, he made his name defending his vision of Islam against 2 major sects, the Mu'tazila and the Jamiyah.
Right.
Now, earlier we teased that the Mu'tazila were essentially like Greek philosophy nerds. What were they actually arguing?
So the Mu'tazila were the extreme rationalists of the day. They had absorbed a ton of Hellenistic Aristotelian logic.
Okay.
And they believed that human reason was the ultimate arbiter of truth, even above revelation itself.
Wow, so reason beats the text.
To them, yes. If a scriptural text seemed to contradict human logic, the Mu'tazila would twist, reinterpret, or allegorize the text until it fit their logical framework.
That sounds like a tough crowd to debate.
Incredibly powerful, intellectually intimidating, and they had a massive presence in the Transoxiana region.
Right. And what about the other group, the Jamiyah?
The Jamiyah were slightly different, but equally challenging. They were extreme deniers of God's attributes.
What does that mean, practically?
Well, they believe that if you say God has attributes like seeing, hearing, or speaking, you're basically saying God is like a human.
Oh, I see. They wanted to avoid comparing God to creation.
Exactly. So to protect God's absolute uniqueness, they stripped away almost all of his attributes.
Even what, exactly?
Basically reducing the concept of God to an abstract, almost unknowable philosophical void.
Wow. So al-Maturidi looks at this landscape. On one side, extreme rationalists elevating the human brain over the holy book.
Yep.
On the other side, extreme abstract thinkers turning God into a blank slate.
Right.
And he decides to build a fortress right in the middle. He decides to use the weapons of the philosophers, rational proofs, intense logical structures, to defend orthodox Islamic doctrines.
What's fascinating here is the sheer ambition of that project.
It's massive.
He is essentially saying, I am going to beat the rationalists at their own game.
But here is where we hit that incredible historical mystery we mentioned at the very start.
The biography.
Yeah. For a man who built such a monumental intellectual edifice, we know almost nothing about his actual life.
The biographical record is a complete mess.
It's wild. Nobody recorded his exact birth year.
No one.
The historians literally had to play detective and reverse engineer his birth year by looking at the death dates of the people who taught him.
It's forensic history.
It's exactly like dating an ancient artifact by looking at the soil layers around it.
Yeah.
We only know when this immensely influential figure was born by looking at the academic rings of the teachers buried in the historical strata around him.
That forensic process they used is quite revealing, actually.
Walk us through it.
So, historians looked at one of his reputed teachers, a man named Muhammad bin Muqatil al-Razi. Now, the public records show that al-Razi died in the year 248 of the Hijri calendar, or 248 AH.
Okay, let's unpack this math. If his teacher died in 248 AH, the historians assume that al-Maturidi would have had to be at least 10 years old at the time to realistically be sitting in his classes, right?
Right, because he wasn't studying basic memorization. He was studying complex theology and jurisprudence.
Which definitely requires a bit more maturity. So if he was 10 years old in 248, that places his birth year around 238 AH.
That was the initial mathematical hypothesis.
But
the historians who compiled our critical source material immediately throw cold water on that theory.
you don't buy it.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They argue that the academic connection between al-Maturidi and al-Razi is historically shaky at best.
Like there's no hard proof he ever actually sat in al-Razi's circle.
Exactly. There's no solid proof. So, stripping away that assumption, the authors conclude that a much more accurate estimate for his birth is actually 20 years later, in 258 AH.
It's just wild to me, and it honestly doesn't get much better when we look at his death date.
No, it's just as messy.
The general consensus is that he died in 333 AH, but then you have these rogue historians messing up the timeline.
You do.
One historian, Haji Khalifa, wrote 332 AH in one of his books, and another scholar, Abdulaziz al-Farhari, wrote 335 AH.
And our source material ruthlessly dismisses those alternative dates.
They really do.
They call the 335 AH date an outright illusion, just a typo or a printing error.
And what about the 332 date?
They point out that Haji Khalifa, the guy who wrote 332, actually wrote 333 AH in all his other books.
Oh, so he just slipped up on one manuscript.
Exactly, meaning he likely just made a mistake. The critical consensus is locked in at 333 AH, and all other claims are thrown out.
I have to ask you, though, doesn't it seem ironic?
In what way?
A man whose ideas would later rigidly govern the theology of empires has a personal biography filled with typos, illusions, and highly educated guesses. Why do you think history preserved his mind but completely lost his life story?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's actually a very common phenomenon in intellectual history.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. A thinker's ideas very often outpace their personal biography. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi wasn't a celebrity in the modern sense.
He wasn't on the cover of magazines.
Exactly. He wasn't a politician or a conquering general. He was an intellectual architect working in the background, building a logical framework.
So his personal life just didn't matter to his followers as much as his arguments did.
Right. His legacy wasn't built on a cult of personality around what he ate for breakfast or where he traveled. It was built entirely by his students.
Right. Scholars like Abu al-Qasim al-Hakim al-Samarqandi and Ali al-Rustafuni.
Those the ones.
They were the ones who took his highly complex frameworks and actually broadcast them to the world.
They did the heavy lifting of spreading the ideas.
And speaking of networks, our sources give us this truly fascinating anecdote about his teachers and the academic environment of Samarkand.
The story of Aliyadi.
Yes. He had a prestigious chain of scholars guiding him, but one guy in particular stands out, Abu Nasr Aliyadi.
Aliyadi is a legendary figure in these texts. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a prodigy.
He was the head of the scholars, leading the heaviest theological debates when he was barely in his 20s.
It's incredible to think about.
The historical accounts say that no one from the opposing sects could bring a complex Quranic verse or a logical trap to challenge him without Aliyadi instantly silencing and defeating them.
But his story also highlights the extreme physical danger of this era.
Right, it wasn't just a classroom.
Transoxiana was a borderland. It wasn't just intellectual warfare, it was literal warfare.
Yeah.
The texts note that Aliyadi was captured by hostile forces in the lands of the Turks.
Wow.
He was martyred, killed patiently and courageously during the era of the local ruler Nasr bin Ahmad. And he died in his 20s.
But the legacy he left behind is just staggering. When he was killed, he left behind 40 prominent, fully trained scholars who became the peers and contemporaries of al-Maturidi.
One 20-something kid leaves behind an entire academy of heavyweight theologians.
It really paints a picture of Samarkand not just as a dusty outpost, but as a vibrant, intense, high-stakes battlefield where ideas were literally a matter of life and death.
Exactly. And to survive on an intellectual battlefield that intense, you don't just need students.
What else do you need?
You need ammunition. You need texts. Which brings us to the actual library of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi.
Let's open the vault. Because al-Maturidi spent his life writing, and the historical records break down his written legacy into 3 distinct categories.
Let's lay them out.
First, tafsir, which is Quranic exegesis or commentary. Second, kalam, which we briefly touched on as speculative philosophical theology.
And the third?
Usul al-fiqh, which is the foundational methodology of Islamic jurisprudence. Basically, the rules for making the rules.
Let's start with what his followers consider his absolute masterpiece, his tafsir.
Okay.
It's a massive book called Tawilat al-Sunnah, sometimes known as Tawilat al-Quran.
And how is it viewed by his followers?
According to the historical consensus of the Maturidiya, this is the unrivaled gold standard. It survived completely intact, with many manuscript copies still existing today. For his followers, no other book of Quranic exegesis, not before him and not after him, can even hold a candle to it.
It's their anchor. But then we get to his flagship theological book, the Book of Kalam.
Ah, yes.
And this is where the story gets really, really interesting. The book is called Kitab al-Tawhid, the Book of Monotheism.
This is the ultimate reference point for understanding what Maturidi beliefs actually are.
And it was incredibly groundbreaking for its time because it didn't just start by talking about God. It opened with a deep dive into epistemology.
Epistemology being the theory of knowledge. Like, how do we actually know what we know?
Right. Do we know things through our senses, through our intellect, or through divine reports?
Starting a book of theology with an epistemological breakdown is a highly philosophical approach. He was setting the rules of the game before he even started playing.
But here is the massive catch. The historical sources point out that Kitab al-Tawhid is an absolute nightmare to read.
It really is.
And we aren't just taking the word of his critics here. We are taking the word of his own top-tier followers.
Yeah, even his defenders struggled with it.
There's a scholar named Abu al-Yusr al-Bazdawi who was a major Maturidi heavyweight in the generations that followed.
And al-Bazdawi goes on the record, in writing, to complain about his own founder's book.
It's kind of hilarious.
He says that the book, composed by the Sheikh, Abu Mansur, is full of obscure phrases.
Just dense.
He says it has complex and ambiguous meanings, a closed-off, incredibly difficult vocabulary, and to top it all off, it suffers from terrible organization.
Okay, let's unpack this because it baffles me. Why would you write a foundational text, a book literally designed to defend your faith and clarify it against opponents in a way that is utterly impenetrable even to your own loyal followers?
That's a great question.
Doesn't that completely defeat the purpose of writing it in the first place?
Well, this raises a crucial question about the target audience of historical texts. You have to put yourself in al-Maturidi's shoes.
Okay, I'm in Samarkand.
He is not writing a populist pamphlet to hand out in the marketplace of Samarkand. He is not writing for the everyday farmer or merchant.
Who is he writing for, then?
He is engaging in high-level intellectual warfare against the Mu'tazila, who are heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and complex Aristotelian logic. He is building a highly technical philosophical defense mechanism.
So he's basically writing in code. He's writing in the hyper-specific mathematical language of the academic elite.
Precisely. There is a fundamental tension in religious history between high-level philosophical defense and accessible public theology.
Right.
Al-Maturidi built the intellectual fortress, but the architecture was so complex that later scholars like al-Bazdawi himself had to come along and basically write the translation manual so the rest of the movement could actually understand what their founder was saying.
I love the analogy of a software developer. It's like al-Maturidi wrote the deep back-end source code. It runs perfectly, it defends against all the viruses, but it's just endless screens of green text. Nobody can actually use it until a front-end developer comes along a century later and builds a nice, clickable user interface.
That's a perfect way to look at it. But as difficult as Kitab al-Tawhid is, it is undisputedly his book.
Right.
The historical sources spend a significant amount of time doing forensic analysis on books that are completely fake.
The time-traveling books.
Yes.
This is my favorite part of the historical detective work.
It's pretty entertaining.
There are several works, specifically a commentary called Shar al-Fiqh al-Akbar and a treatise called Risala fi al-Aqwaid that for a very long time were slapped with al-Maturidi's name on the cover.
People just assumed he wrote them.
But our sources prove they are complete fakes using the ultimate historical gotcha moment.
And how exactly did the historians pull off that gotcha?
Well, the researchers open up these manuscripts, right? And inside they find paragraphs explicitly critiquing, analyzing, and attacking the Ash'ari sect.
The timeline problem.
Right. The problem is the timeline. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the founder of that rival sect, was a contemporary of al-Maturidi.
They lived and died around the exact same time.
The Ash'ari school of thought did not exist as a recognized, codified, organized sect with that specific name until well after both men were dead and buried.
So he couldn't have written it.
Al-Maturidi could not possibly have written a book critiquing an organized sect that didn't exist during his lifetime. It's like finding a letter supposedly written by Abraham Lincoln where he complains about people scrolling on their smartphones. It instantly breaks the timeline.
It is a brilliant piece of textual criticism. And it's not just our specific source that caught this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the text notes that European Orientalists like the famous Dutch scholar Wensink, as well as Muslim researchers like Al-Kauthari, checked the manuscript archives across the world.
What did they find?
They cross-referenced these supposed Maturidi books and found that other copies of the exact same manuscripts actually attribute the text to a much later scholar named Abu al-Lithal al-Samarqandi.
So why slap al-Maturidi's name on it in the first place?
Because of the prestige.
Ah, of course.
It highlights how desperately later generations wanted to attach their own theological commentaries to the unassailable authority of the Founding Father. If you want your book to be read, you put a famous name on it.
Which brings us to the final part of his library, the lost books.
The ones that didn't survive.
The historical sources mention two major books on jurisprudence that al-Maturidi wrote, Mawaqid al-Shara'i and al-Jadal.
Right.
They are considered completely lost to history. They don't exist anymore. And the reason why they vanished is almost tragic.
Why is that?
The texts quote a later scholar named al-Bukhari, who explains that these books were the absolute pinnacle of mastery. They combined deep roots with practical branches. They were brilliant, so why were they lost?
Because of human laziness.
Exactly. The later scholars simply lacked the ambition to study them.
They were just too hard to read.
The language was too harsh. The meanings were too wild and complex. The vocabulary was too dense. And so, because they were too hard to read, the students stopped copying them.
And if a manuscript isn't copied, it rots, it burns, or it just vanishes into the sands of time.
It is a very sobering reminder about how history actually works. Survival in the historical record isn't just about brilliance. It's about accessibility and utility.
If the next generation refuses to copy your manuscript because it makes their head hurt, your masterpiece is gone forever. The preservation of knowledge is an active, physical process.
Which makes the survival of his core theological ideas even more impressive. His jurisprudence books vanished, but his theology survived.
It did.
So let's look at what actually survived. Let's break down the core theology, the actual ideas that al-Maturidi engineered to balance reason and revelation.
And as we go through these, we must keep our critical sources in mind. Our sources are outlining these 6 defining pillars of Maturidi thought, but they are actively comparing them to the Salaf, the early generations, and pointing out where they believe al-Maturidi deviated from the original blueprint.
Right, they're basically doing an audit of his theology. Let's start with the first pillar, epistemology, or his approach to how we acquire knowledge.
Okay.
According to the text, al-Maturidi strictly forbade taqlid, which means blind imitation.
So no, just following the crowd.
Exactly. You couldn't just believe in God because your parents believed or because society told you to. He leaned very close to the philosophers of his time, arguing that knowing God is absolutely mandatory purely through rational deduction.
You have to use your intellect, your accolade.
Right.
And he took it a step further. He argued that this intellectual duty, this moral obligation to figure out that God exists, applies even before any divine revelation, or Sam, arrives via a prophet.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of the classic desert island scenario.
Okay, paint the picture.
You have a person stranded on an island. They have never seen a holy book, never heard of a prophet, never been taught any religion.
A total blank slate.
According to al-Maturidi, that person's brain alone, just observing the stars and the ocean, is enough to logically deduce that a creator exists.
And not only is it enough, they are morally obligated to do so.
Exactly. If they don't, they are held accountable by God.
Now, why do our critical sources have a huge problem with this?
Because it sounds familiar.
Yes, because they point out that this view is almost perfectly identical to the Mu'tazila, the very extreme rationalists al-Maturidi was supposed to be fighting.
Exactly. Our sources argue this is a major deviation from the early generations.
The Salaf.
The Salaf. And the critical sources defending their view firmly believe that true accountability, reward, and punishment only come after divine revelation arrives.
You can't punish the guy on the desert island if you never get the message.
But al-Maturidi elevated the human intellect to such a high degree that it basically acts as its own internal prophet.
It is a profound debate about the limits and the authority of the human mind.
It really is.
The second core pillar, the critic's audit, is his view on the names and attributes of God. Now, on the surface, al-Maturidi agreed with the early generations on a fundamental rule. God's names are taqifaya,
which means they are strictly revealed. You can't just invent names for God.
Yeah.
If God didn't call himself a specific name in the text, you don't get to add it to the list.
But the critical source sharply critiques al-Maturidi and his followers because, in actual practice, they broke their own rule.
How so?
They added names derived entirely from logic and philosophy. Names like al-Sani, the maker, and al-Qadim, the ancient.
Now, I can hear someone listening right now saying, wait, what's wrong with calling God the maker? Doesn't God make things?
It seems harmless enough.
Right. And the critical source actually addresses this. They say the Maturidists fail to differentiate between describing what God does and assigning an official capital letter name to God.
It's the difference between a verb and a proper noun. I can describe you as someone who runs, but I don't change your legal name to the runner.
Oh, that makes sense.
The critics argue that by injecting philosophical terms as official names of God, they blurred the sacred boundaries.
And it gets deeper than that, right?
Yeah, and worse, while they were adding logical names, they were simultaneously using that same logic to interpret away, or outright deny, other attributes that were explicitly mentioned in the texts, simply because those attributes didn't fit neatly into their Aristotelian framework.
They were editing the blueprint.
Okay.
Which leads perfectly into the third issue, and honestly, this is the one that completely breaks my brain, the paradox of vision.
This is perhaps one of the most logically tangled points in the entire theology.
Okay, so Maturidi strongly affirmed, based on clear scriptural texts, that believers will physically see God in the afterlife.
The text says it, so he affirms it, period.
And this is a massive fictive, but because of his philosophical logic, he completely denied that God exists in any physical direction or in any spatial location whatsoever.
Okay, he argued that God is not above, not below, not to the left, not inside the universe, and not outside of it. And our source just absolutely pounces on that.
Oh, they tear it apart.
The author points out the glaring, almost comical, logical contradiction. How can you see something with your physical eyes if that something is not in front of you, not above you, and not occupying any direction in relation to you?
The text states that affirming visual sight while absolutely denying direction is a fundamental impossibility.
It's a paradox.
The source quotes earlier critics who mock this idea, saying the Maturidists are essentially trying to prove the existence of something that fits the exact literal definition of non-existence.
Right.
If it's not anywhere, it's nowhere.
And the mental gymnastics required to defend this get wild.
Wild is an understatement. The text mentions that to defend this paradox, some later Maturidi scholars argued that sight doesn't actually require the object to be in front of you.
What was their example?
They said you could theoretically have a vision of a blind man in China seeing a mosquito in Andalusia.
That is just absurdism.
Completely.
The critical text dismisses that defense entirely, saying that is merely mental imagination or a miracle of knowledge. It's not actual physical optical sight, which is what the original scriptures promise.
So what does this all mean? Why would a genius like Maturidi back himself into such a bizarre logical corner?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it goes back to the battlefield he was standing on.
The debates in Samarkand.
Maturidi was trying to build a bulletproof logical fortress against two extremes. On one side, he had the extreme rationalists, the Mu'tazila, who said God cannot have a body or occupy space, therefore he cannot be seen at all, period. The texts about seeing him are just metaphors.
And the other side.
On the other side, he had extreme literalists who might imagine God as a physical entity with dimensions sitting in a specific geographic chair.
So Maturidi tried to thread the needle. He told the literalists, we will see him because the text said so. And he told the rationalists, but we won't see him in a direction because logic forbids it.
Exactly. He tried to split the difference. But our critical source argues that in trying to thread that needle, he just tangled the thread entirely, creating a paradox that makes no logical or textual sense.
Okay, let's look at the fourth pillar, which deals with human action. Free will versus determinism.
A classic debate.
Are we just biological robots following a divine script, or do we actually write our own destiny?
What was his stance?
Maturidi proposed a highly technical middle ground called the cause theory, which translates to acquisition. He argued that humans are the true actors, we make the choice, but God actually creates the action in reality.
To explain this mechanism, he divided human power into two distinct sequential categories.
Okay, break them down.
First, there is possible power. This simply means having the healthy limbs, the physical tools, and the mental capacity necessary to perform an action. You have legs, you are healthy, so you possess the possible power to walk across the room.
But having the tools doesn't mean the action exists yet.
Right. So he introduces the second category, facilitating power.
And what is that?
This is an extra, instantaneous, divine push of ease granted directly by God at the exact microsecond you decide to act.
I picture it like a kid learning to ride a bike with their parent.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
The kid is sitting there, they have the physical ability to pedal, and they make the conscious choice to steer. That choice, that intention, is the human cause, the acquisition.
The possible power.
Exactly. But the parent is holding the back of the seat, providing the actual kinetic momentum, the balance, and the physics that make the bike move forward. That is God's facilitating power bringing the action into reality. We choose, but God powers the choice.
It's a very elegant, intricate philosophical split to try to preserve both human moral responsibility and God's absolute sovereign power over all creation.
But the critics aren't fans.
However, our critical source notes that while this is a clever philosophical mechanism, this intense hair-splitting of power veers completely away from the straightforward, unphilosophical understanding of the early generations.
I just kept it simple.
Right. They accepted free will and divine decree without needing to diagram the physics of it.
The fifth point the text highlights is incredibly relevant to everyday life. His definition of faith, or iman. What actually makes someone a believer?
This is a huge one.
Al-Maturidi argued that faith is purely pasdik, an inner affirmation and conviction located exclusively in the heart.
And this is a massive divergence from the early generations.
How so?
Al-Maturidi argued that faith is not essentially tied to the verbal declaration of the tongue, and crucially, it is entirely separate from physical actions.
So actions don't count towards faith.
In his view, your actions praying, fasting, giving charity are consequences of faith, but they're not the core of faith itself.
This has massive real-world implications, especially for the legal system.
Absolutely.
Because faith is only a static switch in the heart, Al-Maturidi believed that a major sinner, someone who commits terrible, destructive crimes but still holds the conceptual belief of God in their heart, does not lose their faith.
Don't leave the fold.
Exactly. They do not leave the fold of Islam. They remain a full, complete believer, albeit a highly disobedient one.
You can see how this mindset would appeal to a vast, diverse, and perhaps morally complicated empire later on.
It's a very big tent.
It creates a very broad, very forgiving baseline for who gets to be considered part of the community.
But the critics absolutely hate it. They argue this divorces belief from behavior.
Yeah, they see it as a dangerous split.
And Al-Maturidi took this strict logic of the heart to another extreme. He strictly forbade a phrase that was incredibly common among early Muslims.
Which phrase?
He said a person must never, ever say, I am a believer, inshallah, or I'm a believer, God willing.
Why would he ban such a common phrase?
Because for Al-Maturidi, faith is an absolute binary certainty in the heart. It's either 100% or it's 0%.
Okay.
Adding a caveat, an exception, or a God willing to your statement of faith implies a percentage of doubt. You're saying, I hope I'm a believer.
And doubt is bad.
In his rigorous logical framework, any doubt whatsoever equals disbelief. Therefore, you must state your faith as an absolute, current, unshakable certainty. No exceptions.
Our source contrasts this sharply with the Salaf, the early generations.
What did they do?
The Salaf openly allowed and even encouraged the God-willing exception.
Why?
Because they viewed faith not just as a static thought in the heart, but as a living thing that encompassed physical actions and spiritual states. Things that naturally fluctuate, rise, and fall, and might be incomplete at any given moment.
Ah, so it's a spectrum.
Right. Saying God willing wasn't a doubt in the core truth of God. It was a humble acknowledgement of their own imperfect actions.
So when you step back and look at these core doctrines, elevating reason before revelation, adding logical rules to the names of God, the paradox of seeing God without direction, the hyperspecific cause theory of free will, and defining faith as a static inner absolute, you see a highly engineered, deeply philosophical system.
You are looking at a theology built to survive in a crucible of debate.
It's armor.
Exactly. It relies heavily on defining terms, drawing strict logical boundaries, and utilizing Greek-influenced logic to defend Islamic tenets against other philosophers. It is a massive intellectual defense mechanism.
But according to our source, in building that defense mechanism, he strayed into the very philosophical mud he was trying to combat. He became the thing he was fighting.
That is the ultimate critique of the text.
But here is the historical reality. Whether the critics agree with it or not, this complex, murky, highly intellectual system didn't just survive in a dusty library.
No, it did not.
It conquered the world. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most astonishing part of this story, the 1,000-year expansion.
How did a complex theology, written in books so difficult even the followers complained about them, survive for a millennium and take over the globe?
It didn't happen overnight. The historical source breaks this timeline down meticulously, showing how an idea institutionalizes over centuries.
Walk us through the eras.
First, you have the Foundation era. Al-Maturidi himself, from 258 to 333 AH, fighting the debates and establishing the raw arguments.
The source code.
Exactly. Then comes the Formation era, from 333 to roughly 400 AH. This is when his surviving students actually codify his scattered thoughts and form a recognizable school.
They start building the user interface.
Right. Then you move into the Bazdawi era in the 5th century, heavily focused on spreading and simplifying the texts.
And
then the Nasafi era, stretching deep into the 700s AH. The text notes this was an era of massive, unprecedented literary production.
they weren't just writing dense philosophical tomes anymore.
No, they were writing quick summaries, easily memorized poems, and basic educational manuals to cement the doctrine into the minds of young students.
They packaged the software for mass distribution.
But then we hit the climax, the
Yeah.
turning point of world history for this sect.
The Ottoman engine.
The source calls the next stage the mother of all stages. This is the era from the 700s AH all the way into the 1900s. And this is where theology meets imperial statecraft.
Because a sect's survival rarely relies solely on the absolute purity of its philosophical arguments. It relies on institutional power.
Here's where the mechanics of history get really interesting. The mighty Ottoman Empire, as it expands and conquers, needs a unified legal code to govern its massive, diverse territories.
Right, you need laws for an empire.
They officially adopt the Hanafi school of Islamic law as their state law. It's flexible, it's rational, it works well for an empire.
But historically, over the centuries, the scholars of the Hanafi legal school had deeply tethered themselves to the Maturidi school of theology.
The two became intertwined.
So when the Ottomans decided to standardize their empire's legal system, they essentially mandated the Maturidi theology along with it.
The source is very explicit about how this mechanism worked. It states that as the Sultanate expanded its borders, the Maturidi influence expanded perfectly in sync with the armies and the trade routes.
The empire controlled the bureaucracy. They appointed the judges in the courts.
They appointed the muftis who issued legal edicts.
They appointed the leaders of the massive state mosques. And crucially, they funded and controlled the heads of the educational madrasas.
And who did they appoint? Hanafi Maturidi scholars.
So across Eastern Europe, the Arab world, Persia, Turkey, and all the way down into India, this highly specific philosophical theology became the institutional default.
If you wanted a job in the government, if you wanted to be a judge, if you wanted your school funded by the Sultan, you adopted this theology.
It's exactly like your software developer analogy. Al-Maturidi wrote the code in Samarkand in the 9th century. His students patched it and made the manuals.
But it remained localized software until the Ottomans came along.
And decided to pre-install it on every single computer in every single school and court in their massive global empire. Theology rode on the back of politics and state funding.
When kings and sultans fund the schools, a niche philosophical debate from Transoxiana becomes the unquestioned everyday worldview of millions of people who have never even heard the name Al-Maturidi.
And that institutional momentum is so powerful that it carries forward even after empires collapse.
That is the true testament to institutionalization. The text traces how this Ottoman-fueled expansion seeded the Indian subcontinent,
Even as the Mughal and Ottoman empires waned, the theological DNA remained.
leading to massive spin-off movements in later centuries that still wield incredible political and social influence today.
Right, our sources break down these modern Indian subcontinent factions, and it is vital to understand why they splintered.
What caused the split?
When an empire falls, or when it faces external pressure like British colonialism in India, the local cultures and political pressures mix with the baseline theology.
Creating wildly different flavors from the same source code.
Exactly. The diversity of these modern branches is staggering. First, the text highlights the Deobandi movement, which emerged in the 19th century as an anti-colonial educational revival.
What were they like?
The text describes them as absolute master scholars of Hadith, incredibly ascetic in their lifestyle, but heavily influenced by Sufi mysticism and fiercely, almost aggressively loyal to the Hanafi and Maturidi schools.
The critical source actually accuses them of blind fanaticism, claiming they will twist textual evidence just to fit their predetermined Hanafi Maturidi rulings.
But then, out of that same Indian subcontinent, you have their bitter rivals, the Barelvi movement.
And our text is incredibly harsh here.
They're very harsh.
While the Deobandis focused on strict scholarship, the Barelvi movement absorbed a lot of local cultural practices.
The source describes this faction as being marked by extreme veneration of saints and graves.
Practices the source outright labels as polytheistic, and it notes their intense, volatile hostility, pointing out their willingness to legally excommunicate and declare the Deobandis as heretics, let alone anyone else.
So you have two massive groups, both tracing their roots back to the same maturity theological baseline, but wildly divided by cultural practice and methodology.
Then the text introduces the Qathari era, named after a highly influential 20th century scholar, Muhammad Zahid al-Qathari.
Al-Qathari is noted in the text for his fierce, almost venomous hostility toward anyone following the early Salaf.
He accused the Salafists of being anthropomorphists,
meaning he accused them of giving God a literal human physical form simply because they affirmed the scriptural attributes without logical caveats.
The text claims Qathari basically tried to revive the extreme, combative, rationalist doctrines of the Mu'tazila to fight his modern theological wars.
And lastly, just to show how complex this web gets, the source mentions a fascinating modern branch, the Panjpiri.
This group is focused heavily on strict monotheism. They actively fight against the grave worship and superstitions of the Barelvis.
They translate the Quran, they fight for pure worship.
Which makes them sound exactly like the Salafists our critical source defends.
On the surface, yes. But the source notes the deep irony.
What's the irony?
Despite aligning with the Salafists on these practical everyday issues of worship, the Panjpiri still hold firmly to the complex philosophical maturity views on the attributes of God.
It shows just how incredibly deep that original philosophical DNA is embedded.
You can change your practice, you can fight superstitions, but the epistemological baseline installed centuries ago remains intact.
It is an incredible, tangled web. And it brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize the immense ground we've covered.
We started with an enigmatic scholar, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi.
A man whose birth year is a total guess, writing incredibly dense, almost unreadable books in the frontier city of Samarkand to fight off extreme rationalists.
He built a complex theological system, elevating logical deduction, separating faith from action, and redefining the attributes of God to avoid the traps of Greek philosophy.
A system that could have easily vanished, but was preserved by dedicated students, simplified and codified over centuries, and then supercharged by the vast political and bureaucratic machinery of the Ottoman Empire.
Transforming a local debate into a global, institutionalized movement that deeply influences the core beliefs of hundreds of millions of Muslims today across the world.
Understanding these historical currents is absolutely vital. It helps us realize that the religious, philosophical, and legal ideas people hold today, the things they consider basic, unquestionable common sense, didn't just drop out of the sky fully formed.
Exactly. They were argued over in life or death debates. They were written in complex, badly organized books. They were saved from the flames by diligent scribes, and they were, crucially, mandated by the political decisions of long-gone empires.
History and theology are never a clean, simple blueprint. They are the messy, cumulative, fascinating result of centuries of human intellect, intense debate, and raw institutional power.
It really puts our current world into perspective.
And that leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to ponder. When you look around at the deeply held mainstream beliefs in your own culture today, the things society assumes are just universal, objective truth. How much of what you accept as reality is actually just the byproduct of a political decision made by an empire centuries ago?
It's a question worth asking.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history around you. We'll see you next time.
Imagine, for just a second, that you are tasked with mathematically proving the existence of God.
Oh, wow. Good luck with that.
Right.
Okay.
But seriously, imagine you're sitting there, setting up an equation, using this absolute, rigid, unbreakable logic that the ancient Greeks used to, map the stars and define geometry.
Okay, I'm with you. Pure rationalism.
Exactly. Pure rationalism. But at the exact same time, in the exact same breath, you are trying to argue that human beings have total free will in a universe where literally every single action, every leaf falling from a tree, every thought that crosses your mind is already predestined and written down before time even began.
Yeah, that's a profound, almost terrifying intellectual burden to put on someone.
It really is.
Because you are trying to bridge this massive gap between pure, cold, geometric rationalism and these deeply spiritual, unseeable realities of ancient scripture.
Right.
You basically have two fundamentally different operating systems, right? Greek philosophy and divine revelation. And you're trying to force them to run on the exact same hard drive.
Which sounds like a recipe for a system crash.
Yeah.
But welcome back to another deep dive, everyone. We are thrilled you're joining us because today's mission is exactly that. We are watching ancient scholars try to force those two operating systems together.
Yeah, we're unpacking the incredibly complex, historically dense theological architecture of the Maturidi school of Islamic theology.
Right, and we're going to zoom in on how they engineer the mechanics of the afterlife, how they tried to solve that crazy paradox of human free will, and how they fought these really bitter intellectual wars with their rivals.
It's fascinating stuff. But before we jump in, a quick note for you listening.
Oh yeah, very important.
These texts we're analyzing today, they are historically charged. We're talking about debates where different groups absolutely despised each other's conclusions.
Yeah, they were not pulling punches.
Yeah.
So we just want to be clear that we aren't here to pick a winner. We aren't endorsing any specific religious doctrine or validating the critiques we're going to talk about.
Exactly. We're just acting as your guides through this sort of intellectual museum. We're looking impartially at the architecture of their arguments so you can understand the minds of the time.
So you can see how they built these ideas. And to understand the Maturidi mind, which is named after the 10th century scholar Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, right?
Right, exactly.
You have to start with how they actually define knowledge in the first place.
Yeah, because before you can argue about God, you have to agree on how a human being can actually, know anything at all.
Right. And the texts show that when it came to the physical world, or proving that a creator exists, the Maturidists were aggressively rational. They used intense, heavy logic.
Oh, absolutely. But, and this is a big but, they drew a massive hard line in the sand when it came to what happens after you die.
Eschatology, the end of times, the afterlife.
Yes. For the afterlife, they introduced this epistemological category called semiat.
Semiat. What does that actually mean?
It roughly translates to things known only through hearing.
Hearing, like literally just listening.
Basically, yeah. Meaning revelation. Things you only know because a prophet spoke them or a scripture recorded them.
Oh, I see.
They basically argued that human reason is this incredibly powerful flashlight, but its battery completely dies the moment you hit the grave.
Wow. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you just cannot use Aristotelian logic to deduce what heaven looks like or what the mechanics of judgment are. You just have to listen to the text and accept it.
Which honestly feels, to me at least, like a sudden slamming of the brakes.
How so?
Well, I mean, if you are going to spend your whole life using Greek philosophy to prove God's attributes, why suddenly abandon it when talking about the afterlife? Like, why not philosophize the afterlife too?
That's a fair question. But for them, it was because they believed that reason has jurisdictional limits.
Like it only has authority over certain domains.
Exactly. If you try to use reason to invent the details of the unseen world, you aren't doing philosophy anymore. You are just guessing.
Right, making things up.
So, relying entirely on Samiat, the Maturidists aligned strictly with the traditional literalist orthodox texts.
Okay, so what did that look like in practice?
Well, the texts describe a literal torment or bliss in the grave. They describe the Sirat, which is this physical bridge suspended over hell that souls must cross.
Oh, wow. A literal bridge.
Yeah. And they describe massive literal scales of justice that will somehow weigh human deeds.
Wait, weigh deeds, which are abstract actions.
Right, weighing abstract actions as if they were physical weights.
And reason, obviously, can't invent a scale that weighs a lie or a good deed. So the rational brain just has to accept that it happened.
Exactly. Reason steps back and revelation takes the wheel.
Okay, but let's unpack this. Because the text highlights a massive collision right here. A place where reason actually refused to step back. And it created one of the most controversial theological debates of the era.
Oh, you're talking about the vision of God.
Yes, the Ruah, the beatific vision.
Yeah, this was a huge sticking point. So the scripture states that believers in paradise will look upon their Lord. Right.
And the Maturidists, leaning on their rule of Samiate, that hearing rule, they affirmed this. Humans will literally see God.
Okay, so far so good.
But this is where their two operating systems just violently crashed into each other.
Because of the Greek logic side of things.
Exactly, because their rational philosophical theology strictly dictated that God is not a physical body. God is not contained by space. God does not have physical boundaries.
So you have a scripture saying, you will see him, and a philosophy saying he has no physical form to be seen. That's a massive contradiction.
It is. And their solution, the caveat they introduced to fix this, was to say that believers will see God, but without God being in any physical direction.
That what?
Yeah, no, up, down, left, right, front, or back.
That's it. I mean, that's hard to even picture.
And they added that there would be no physical opposition, a concept they called mukabala.
Okay, I have to pause here, because mechanically, that makes zero sense to the human brain.
It's definitely a brain breaker. Right, like how can you see something that isn't physically in front of you? The entire mechanism of human sight relies on light reflecting off a physical object that's situated at a specific point in space, and then that light hitting the retina.
That's the biological reality, yes.
So if there is no direction and no object opposite to the eye, no mukabala, as you said, isn't that like trying to visualize a color that doesn't exist on the light spectrum? You aren't actually describing sight anymore.
You know, it's funny you say that because you are echoing the exact mockery their critics threw at them centuries ago.
Really? So I'm not the only one who thinks this sounds crazy.
Not at all. You are right. It violates the physical mechanics of sight. But you have to understand, the Maturidists were trying to protect two absolute truths simultaneously.
The text and the logic.
Right. If they say God is in front of the believer, they have assigned God a physical location and a boundary. And to them, that was tantamount to saying God is a created object.
Which destroys their entire philosophy.
Exactly. But if they say God cannot be seen at all, they are calling the scripture a lie, which destroys their religion.
So they just smash the two concepts together and expect the human mind to accept a paradox.
Yeah.
You will see him, but not in any way that sight actually works.
Kind of, yeah. Let's try to map a modern analogy onto it just to understand their intent, even if their critics absolutely hated it.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a two-dimensional universe, a flat piece of paper. The beings living on that paper only understand length and width. They have no concept of up or depth.
Okay, like flatland, I'm with you.
Right. Now imagine a three-dimensional object, like an apple, hovering an inch above the paper.
The 2D beings cannot perceive it. It's not in front of them, behind them, or beside them on their 2D plane.
Yeah.
It's literally off their radar.
Right. Now imagine the apple somehow grants a 2D being the ability to perceive it.
Okay.
The 2D being would experience an awareness, a vision of the apple. But if you ask that 2D being, hey, what direction is the apple in? They couldn't answer.
Because it's not north, south, east, or west.
Exactly. It is being perceived entirely outside the geometric rules of their universe. The Maturidists were essentially arguing that the vision of God in the afterlife involves an entirely new paradigm of perception that just doesn't require spatial opposition.
Okay, that actually makes the intent a lot clearer. But the texts we are analyzing severely critique this position, don't they?
Oh, severely is an understatement. The source material doesn't view it as a clever, multidimensional workaround at all. It views it as a blatant, cowardly, logical contradiction.
A cowardly contradiction. Wow.
Yeah, the critique argues that by stripping away direction and physical opposition, the Maturidists didn't redefine sight. They just described something that literally doesn't exist.
And the rival groups just went to town on this.
Oh, the criticism was brutal.
Yeah.
Rival groups, especially the Mu'tazila, who we will definitely get into later, they openly laughed at them.
What'd they say?
They basically said, if you claim a human can see something that isn't in any direction, maybe a blind man in China can see a mosquito in Spain.
Oh, wow. That's actually a pretty good burn for the 10th century.
Right. It became the ultimate point of philosophical ridicule. Their point was, if something is not inside the universe, not outside it, not connected to it, not separated from it, and not in any direction, well, you have philosophized God into nothingness.
Yeah, it really shows the absolute danger of trying to perfectly marry abstract Greek logic with ancient literal theology. When you stretch logic that far to accommodate a text, the whole framework starts to groan under the pressure.
It really does.
And, if you think seeing without a direction is a tightrope walk, the texts show that this was child's play compared to how they tried to explain human free will.
Oh, boy. The labyrinth of Kada and Qadar, predestination.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting for you listening.
Yeah.
Because this is where the theological stakes become incredibly personal for every single human being.
Absolutely.
Let's lay the groundwork for the listener. How do they actually define destiny? Because it's not just, God knows what you're going to do.
No, it's much heavier than that. The texts outline 4 distinct, massive pillars of absolute divine control that the Maturidists affirmed.
Okay, walk us through these 4 levels, because to understand their crisis of free will, we need this foundation.
Right. First is eternal knowledge. God knows everything, every microsecond of history, every thought you will ever have before time even existed. Total omniscience.
Okay, that's level 1, knowing. What's level 2?
Second is the writing. God didn't just know it, he documented it. All destinies are inscribed in what they call the preserved tablet.
Okay, knowing and writing, honestly, that still leaves some room for me to act.
Right.
Maybe God is just a perfect observer who wrote down what he saw I would eventually choose.
But here's where the trap closes. The third level is divine will.
Divine will, meaning?
Meaning nothing happens. Not a single atom vibrates, not a single synapse fires in your brain, unless God actively wills it to happen in that exact moment.
Wow, okay. And the fourth?
The fourth level is creation. God doesn't just watch you do something. God literally actively creates every single action and event as it happens.
Wait, let me get this straight. If God knows it, wrote it down, actively willed it, and then literally created the physical and mental action of me doing it, how in the world am I responsible?
That is the million-dollar question.
Let's ground this in reality. If a person tells a malicious lie, and God created the movement of their tongue, the vibration of the vocal cords, and the neural pathways forming the lie, why is the human punished in hell for it? You've just described a universe of meat puppets.
Meat puppet, that's graphic, but it's exactly the ultimate dilemma of philosophical theology, the problem of evil and responsibility.
Right, because if God is completely sovereign, humans are puppets.
Yes. But if humans have total independent free will to create their own actions out of thin air, then God is not the creator of all things.
Ah, I see the problem.
Right, you've just created billions of mini-gods run around generating their own realities, and that completely violates the absolute oneness and power of God.
So how did the Maturidi solve it? Because they couldn't just throw their hands up and say, oh well. Our material details a highly specific, complex mechanism they invented to thread this needle.
Yes, they utilize a concept called COSB.
COSB?
Which translates to acquisition.
Acquisition. How does a human acquire an action that God already created?
The synthesis is this. Allah is the creator of the action, but the human being acquires the action.
Still sounds like semantics to me. Break it down.
The Maturidists argued that God creates the physical movement, the tongue moving, the vocal cords vibrating, but the human being has a created will and a created capacity that perfectly instantaneously coincides with that action.
Okay.
Because your internal will aligned with the physical action God created in that millisecond, you acquired the moral weight of it. Therefore, you are responsible.
I'm trying to visualize this mechanically. Let's go back to our operating systems and use a video game analogy.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Think about a massive, complex, open-world game. The programmer, representing God, coded the entire universe. They coded the physics engine, the environment, all the possible animations.
Right.
The programmer literally created the digital reality of the character swinging a sword. The code exists, the action is pre-built, but the player sitting on the couch is the one who acquires the action by choosing to press the X button.
Exactly.
The player didn't code the sword swing, they didn't create the pixels, but their will pressing the button coincided with the pre-created animation.
That is an incredibly helpful way to look at cause. In that scenario, God creates both the game's physics, which is the action, and the controller in your hand, which is your capacity.
Right.
In the exact moment you choose to press X, God creates the sword swing on the screen. The Maturidists are trying to separate the creation of a sin, which belongs exclusively to God's ultimate power, from the doing or acquiring of a sin, which belongs to the human's will.
It makes sense as an analogy, but pressing a button still implies a tiny sliver of independent action. And the texts we are reading don't let the Maturidists off the hook that easily.
No, they certainly do not. The critique of this CASB concept is scathing.
What do the critics say?
The source material argues that CASB is a massive departure from the simpler beliefs of the earliest generations, the Salaf. The critique points out the fatal flaw in your video game analogy.
Which is?
In the Maturidi system, God doesn't just create the game and the controller. God creates your desire to press the button, and God creates the pressing of the button itself.
Oh, right. If God creates everything, he created my will to acquire the action too.
Yes.
So it's just turtles all the way down. I'm a puppet whose strings are being pulled to make it look like I'm pulling my own strings.
Precisely the critique. The text argues that by insisting God is the real-time creator of the specific abstract action, the Maturidists stripped human will of any true independent efficacy.
Yeah, you can dress it up in terms like acquisition, but if God created the capacity, the will, and the action simultaneously, Human responsibility just becomes a semantic legal loophole.
Exactly. The early generations accepted a simpler paradox. God is sovereign, but gave humans true, efficacious ability to act.
Keep it simple.
Right. But the Maturidists overcomplicated it, trying to protect their philosophical definition of God as the sole creator of all accidents or actions.
It really feels like they backed themselves into a corner with their own logic, and then they had to invent this incredibly convoluted concept of acquisition just to avoid admitting their math didn't work.
It is the definition of intellectual hair-splitting. It requires immense mental gymnastics.
Cool.
But you have to remember the environment they were in. They weren't doing this in a vacuum. If they conceded even an inch on God being the creator of all actions, they would be devoured by their philosophical rivals.
Which brings us to the most fascinating political and historical dynamic in the texts.
Yeah.
Because while the Maturidists were busy tying their brains into knots, explaining kav and directionless vision, there was another group doing the exact same thing in almost the exact same way.
Yes, the Asharis.
The great historical contemporaries, the two heavyweights of Islamic theology.
Absolutely.
When you read the historical literature, you see this massive list of famous scholars, men who spent their entire lives, wrote encyclopedic volumes of books, debating the differences between the Maturidi school and the Ash'ari school.
Right, scholars like al-Subki, al-Taftazani, al-Kathari.
Yeah, they spent centuries arguing over microscopic theological distinctions.
And this is what's so wild. After detailing centuries of this intense scholarly warfare, the text we are analyzing arrives at a stunning conclusion.
What is it?
The differences between the Maturidists and the Ash'aris were almost entirely semantic.
Semantic.
Yeah.
Centuries of debate, millions of words written, and they basically agreed.
Pretty much. I mean, they might have prioritized slightly different philosophical angles or used different terminology for how God's attributes operate, but they shared the exact same foundational DNA.
Unbelievable. What was that DNA?
They both fundamentally relied on kalam.
Okay, let's define kalam for the listener, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot in these texts.
Kalam literally translates to speech or discourse, but in this context, it means speculative philosophical theology.
So using logic.
Yes, the practice of using rational dialectics, Greek-inspired logic, premise and conclusion argumentation to defend Islamic dogma. Both the Ash'ars and the Maturidists built their schools on kalam.
You know, the text uses this incredibly vivid phrase to describe them. It says they were breastfed from the same mother.
I love that quote. They were intellectual siblings.
It really perfectly captures their origin story. They were both born out of a desire to find a middle ground, right?
Exactly. Imagine a spectrum. On the far right, you have the pure literalists. They completely rejected philosophical reasoning.
If the text says God has a hand, he has a hand, don't ask how, don't use logic.
Right. And then on the far left, you have the extreme rationalists who let Greek logic completely overrule scripture.
Okay, so where did our two sibling groups sit?
The Maturidists and Ash'aris stood right in the middle and said, we are going to use the weapons of the far left, the rationalists' logic, to defend the texts of the far right.
That is such a great way to visualize it. But it begs the question, if they are essentially twins, breastfed from the same mother, why are they two distinct schools?
That's the real question.
Why is there just one giant middle ground kalam school? What kept them debating each other for hundreds of years?
Geography, politics, and the law. This is where theology hits the pavement.
Explain the mechanism of that. How does geography dictate theology?
Well, the Islamic world wasn't a monolith. It was governed by different legal traditions, madhabs. The Maturidi theological school originated in Central Asia, and it became inextricably, permanently tied to the Hanafi legal school.
Okay, so they were a package deal.
Exactly. Where the Hanafi legal tradition went, Maturidi theology rode right there in its backpack. And crucially, the Hanafi school became the official state law of the massive Eastern empires.
Like the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, most notably the Ottoman Empire, but also the Mughal Empire in India.
So if you are a citizen living in, say, 16th century Istanbul, you aren't choosing to be a Maturidi after deeply analyzing the concept of Samiyat.
No, not at all. The Ottoman Sultan appoints a Hanafi judge to your town. That judge sets up a madrasa, a school. The curriculum of that school teaches Hanafi law, which means it automatically teaches Maturidi theology.
Right. The imams in your local mosque are trained in that system.
Exactly. State sponsorship cemented Maturidi theology across Turkey, Central Asia, India, and China.
State-sponsored theology and what's happening in the West.
Meanwhile, the Ash'ari school allied itself with the Shafi'i and Maliki legal schools. Those legal systems were dominant in regions controlled by different empires, like the Mamluks in Egypt, Levant, and North Africa.
So Ash'ari theology became the air you breathed if you lived in Cairo or Damascus.
Spot on.
That is wild to think about. Your entire worldview, how you conceptualize the attributes of the creator of the universe, how you understand your own free will, was largely determined by whether the political border you lived inside was controlled by an Ottoman sultan or a Mamluk sultan.
It really was, and eventually, as the texts note, the term Ash'ari became the dominant umbrella term for both groups globally.
Why is that if the Maturides were so massive in the East?
Mostly because the Ash'ari brand was pushed through incredibly famous Western institutions like Al-Azhar in Egypt, but functionally they were two massive geographically separated monopolies of the same basic methodology.
It really puts our modern concept of absolute truth into perspective. But listen, if the Maturides and Ash'arists were siblings who united to fight the extreme rationalists, we need to talk about those rationalists.
We do.
Because they are the invisible ghost haunting this entire deep dive. Who were they fighting?
The Mu'tazila.
The ultra-rationalists. The texts spend a massive amount of time detailing the battlefield between the Maturides and the Mu'tazila. This was the main event of early Islamic intellectual history.
Oh, without a doubt.
Let's break down exactly where they clashed, because the stakes were incredibly high.
They clashed on the most fundamental questions of what God actually is. Let's look at the first major battlefield, the nature of the Quran.
Okay, what did the Mu'tazila believe about it?
The Mu'tazila, prioritizing pure, unadulterated logic, argued that God is absolutely one and eternally unique. Nothing else is eternal.
Makes logical sense.
Right. Therefore, the Quran, the words, the text, the message, must be a created thing. It was brought into existence by God at a specific point in time.
Which infuriated the Orthodox masses.
Right.
Because to them, the Word of God is divine, not a created object like a tree or a rock.
Exactly.
So how did the Maturides counter this rationally?
The Maturidists developed the concept of kalam nafsi, the internal speech of God.
Internal speech.
They argued that the physical ink, the paper, and the sounds of a human reciting the Quran are indeed created in time, but the attribute of speech inside God's essence is uncreated and eternal.
Ah, so they split the difference between the physical manifestation and the divine attribute.
Clever?
Very. Okay, so clash number one was the Quran. What was the second major disagreement?
The attributes of God.
Like what?
The Mu'tazila looked at attributes like knowledge, power, and life, and they panicked. They thought, if you say God has an attribute called knowledge, you are implying that knowledge is a separate entity that exists alongside God.
Right, because then it sounds like polytheism.
Yeah.
You are multiplying eternal entities.
Exactly. So in their radical minimalism, they said God is knowing, but without an attribute of knowledge. God is powerful, but without an attribute of power.
Which just sounds like a linguistic riddle. How can you be knowing without knowledge? It's like saying a car is red without the property of redness.
Right, it's a very tough sell. The Maturidists forcefully pushed back on this. They spent volumes logically proving that God possesses distinct, real attributes.
Which ones did they focus on?
They affirmed attributes like life, power, knowledge, and one they specifically championed called takwin, the eternal attribute of bringing things into existence.
Okay, so they fought hard for these attributes.
They argued that having attributes doesn't multiply God, it simply describes his perfection.
And the third clash we've already explored, the vision of God.
Right. The Mu'tazila said it's physically impossible to see God because he isn't a physical object. End of story.
While the Maturidists stubbornly insisted you will see him, but invented the directionless vision to make it work.
Exactly. So when you look at these three battlefields, the Quran, the attributes, the vision, you would think the Maturidists and the Mu'tazila are total polar opposites, light and dark.
But the text we are analyzing reveals a massive plot twist. And this is where it gets incredibly profound.
It really does.
Beneath all the screaming, beneath the accusations of heresy, the texts show that these two bitter enemies shared the exact same foundational DNA. They secretly agreed on the most important things.
This is the critical underlying observation of the source material. The Maturidists and the Mu'tazila both relied completely on Greek-inspired logic.
Right.
They were building completely different houses, but they were buying all their lumber and nails from the exact same philosophical hardware store.
I love that. Walk us through those shared tools, because the text lists several massive methodological agreements that prove they were cut from the same cloth.
First is their epistemology regarding God's existence. Both groups believe that knowing God is an obligation of reason before revelation.
Wait, reason before revelation. Meaning what?
Meaning, if you were born on a deserted island and a prophet never came to you, your brain alone is still obligated to deduce that God exists simply by observing the universe. Reason is the supreme vanguard.
Wow. They elevated human logic to the level of divine imperative.
They absolutely did.
What's the second shared tool?
The second tool is exactly how they prove God exists. They both use the exact same philosophical engine, called Dalil al-Huduth, the proof of accidents, or the cosmological argument for creation.
Let's pause here. We need to explain this clearly. What is an accident in this context? Because a listener right now is thinking of a car crash.
Right. In Aristotelian physics, an accident is not a mistake. Think of a wooden cup.
Okay, I'm picturing a wooden cup.
The wood itself is the substance, but the cup being hot or being cold or being painted red or being in the kitchen instead of the living room, those are accidents. They are temporary properties that happen to the substance. They change.
So how does a cup changing temperature prove God exists?
The logic goes like this. The universe is entirely made up of substances and accidents. Everything is constantly changing. A planet moves, a star burns, a human grows old.
Because everything is subject to changing accidents.
The universe itself must be a created thing that had a beginning. If it has a beginning, it requires a beginner. A creator who is not made of substances, not subject to accidents, and not changing.
It is brilliant logic, honestly. But it requires you to accept an entirely Greek, physical model of the universe.
Exactly. Both the Mu'tazila and the Maturidists built their entire religion on this Aristotelian foundation. If you poke a hole in the Greek theory of substances and accidents, their proof of God collapses.
And this shared reliance on logic led them to a shared skepticism of certain texts. This is the third point of agreement, right? The texts note they both rejected ahad hadiths in theology.
Yes, ahad hadiths. These are historical reports transmitted by only one or a few chains of narrators. They are not mass transmitted.
So they're a bit more vulnerable to error.
Exactly. The rationalist mind of both the Maturidists and the Maturidists looked at these reports and applied mathematical probability.
What do they conclude?
They said, a single chain report has a tiny percentage chance of being an error or a fabrication. When it comes to the core theology of who God is, we need 100% rational certainty. We cannot build our foundation on a 99% probability.
So they threw those reports out when it came to dogma, which put them directly at odds with the pure literalists who trusted the historical chains of transmission.
Very much so. And the final, perhaps most fascinating shared tool was their belief in rational morality, a concept called tahsin and takbi.
Rational good and evil.
Yes. Think about how you, listening to this right now, decide if an action is right or wrong.
Okay.
If you see someone steal from an orphan, do you need a holy book to tell you that is evil? Or does your human mind inherently, rationally deduce that it is repulsive?
I'd say the mind deduces it.
Right. Both the Maturidists and the Mu'tazila believed that the human intellect has the independent capacity to recognize objective good tahsin and objective evil takbi independent of revelation.
So you have these two groups. They fight bitterly over the details, but they agreed on the obligation of reason, the Aristotelian proof of God, the rejection of solitary reports, and the rational nature of morality.
Exactly.
This leads us to the ultimate, overarching conclusion of the source material we've been analyzing regarding the Maturidists.
Yes. The texts we are exploring ultimately view the Maturidi school with a highly critical, almost tragic lens.
A tragic lens. How so?
The conclusion is that the Maturidists basically adopted the flawed, corrupted philosophical foundations of the Mu'tazila, hoping they could use them for good.
They tried to take the weapons of the extreme rationalists and use them to defend orthodox traditional beliefs.
But the source argues that you cannot use corrupted tools without corrupting the product. You cannot use Greek logic to map the divine without accidentally turning God into a geometry problem.
Wow.
The text asserts that by relying on Aristotelian accidents, by elevating reason to the point of rejecting historical reports, the tools themselves ultimately corrupted Maturidi theology.
It forced them into those bizarre corners we discussed, like defending a vision of God without direction, or inventing the convoluted legalism of cause to explain free will.
Exactly. They compromised the simplicity of faith to satisfy the rules of a Greek debate club.
We have covered a massive amount of intellectual ground today.
We really have.
We've explored how the Maturidi school attempted to walk an incredibly thin, precarious tightrope. They were desperately trying to balance the strict mathematical logic of philosophy with the ancient, unseeable texts of revelation.
And it resulted in incredibly complex theories.
Right, theories about acquiring predestined actions and seeing a directionless God.
But why does this matter to you? Why should anyone today care about a 10th century debate over Aristotelian accidents or cause?
Yeah, why does it matter?
Because while the vocabulary is ancient, the struggle is entirely modern. How do we today reconcile our incredibly intellectual, logical, scientific brains with spiritual, unseeable, emotional realities?
That's a great point.
We are still walking that exact same maturity tightrope, trying to make the math of our reality fit the poetry of our souls. We just use quantum physics now instead of Greek substances.
Making the math fit the poetry. I love that. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the geography of belief we discussed earlier.
Oh, the Ottoman versus Mamluk divide.
Yes. Think about those millions of people in the East who adopted Maturidi theology because of the Ottoman Empire, and the millions in the West who became Asharis under the Mamluks.
Right.
Look at your own deeply held beliefs today, the things you consider to be absolute, universal, undeniable truths about morality or the universe or God. How much of what you believe right now is actually the objective truth? And how much is simply the legacy of the geography you were born into, the politics of your era, and the specific intellectual tools your ancestors happened to decide to use?
It's a heavy question to walk away with.
It is. Thanks for taking the plunge with us. Keep questioning, keep digging, and we will see you on the next deep dive.
So, if your holy book, right, like the text that you believe, with just every fiber of your being, contains the ultimate infallible truth of the universe.
Right, the absolute truth.
Yeah, exactly, the absolute truth. If that book suddenly told you that 2 + 2 = 5, what would you actually do in that moment?
That is, I mean, that's the ultimate crisis, isn't it?
Totally. Because do you assume the book is just, using some kind of metaphor? Or do you assume that human mathematics is fundamentally flawed?
Right. Which one gives way?
Exactly. It sounds like this really strange thought experiment, but 1,000 years ago, a group of Islamic theologians faced an intellectual crisis that looked a whole lot like this.
They absolutely did.
Because when the logical, rational, pattern-seeking human brain hits a brick wall against divine revelation, which one actually gets the right of way? Like, do you bend your human logic to fit the sacred text, or do you bend the text to fit your human logic?
It's a profound dilemma. And honestly, it's the ultimate intellectual tension. Because how a society or, a school of thought resolves that specific friction, it dictates entirely how they understand reality.
Yeah.
It dictates how they understand divinity and really their own place in the cosmos. We aren't just talking about abstract puzzles here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about the foundational operating system for human belief.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because we are taking a deep dive today into a massive, and I mean incredibly dense stack of sources detailing the Maturidiya.
The Maturidi school, yeah.
Right, the Maturidi school of Islamic theology. But just to be clear right off the bat for you listening, we are not looking at their historical timelines today.
No history lessons on empires today.
Yeah, we're skipping the empires they influenced. We are zooming straight into their philosophical engine. Like, we want to understand the mechanics of how they defined faith.
Nuts and bolt.
Exactly. How they use these complex, almost Aristotelian-style mathematics to try and prove God exists. And I think most interestingly, what kind of collateral damage occurs when human logic violently collides with the divine script.
Framing the scope here is absolutely crucial before we begin, because the source material we are working with today, it's not some neutral, bird's eye view encyclopedia entry.
Not even close.
No, it is a highly structured, deeply philosophical, and really heavy critique of the Maturidi school.
Right.
And it's written from a specific theological standpoint. It represents the Salafi or al-Sunnah perspective. So our mission here, for you listening, is to navigate this massive intellectual battlefield as objective guides.
Right. We're completely neutral here.
Completely. We will reconstruct the Maturidi philosophy in all its complex glory to understand how it functions, but we will equally unpack the source text's counterarguments.
To see where they think the machinery breaks down.
Exactly. We are analyzing the claims within the text. We aren't endorsing either side.
And to really get into the headspace of these theologians, I want you, the listener, to just ask yourself a question. Have you ever tried to logically, scientifically, prove something you just inherently feel?
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, try formulating a rigorous mathematical proof for why you love your family.
It's impossible.
It's incredibly hard. But the Maturidi theologians were attempting something similar, just on a cosmic scale. They wanted to build a logically bulletproof framework for faith.
And you have to remember the environment they were in. They were operating in a world where early Islamic thought was suddenly slamming into Greek philosophy.
Oh, right. The Greek influence is huge here.
It's massive.
Hmm.
And they felt this intense pressure to systemize everything.
And that collision with Greek thought is really the catalyst for everything we're going to dive into today. Because to systemize their theology, the Maturidists had to build an epistemology.
Right, a theory of how we actually know what we know.
Exactly. And they started by dividing all human knowledge into two very rigid, distinct categories.
Very rigid.
Yeah. So first, you have the akliyat, which translates to rational matters. And second, you have the samiyat, which are textual or transmitted matters.
So let's define those boundaries clearly. Akliyat are things you can deduce using just the raw processing power of your brain.
Just pure logic.
Pure logic, cause and effect. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C.
Right. You do not need a holy book to tell you that.
Exactly. Your mind just inherently recognizes the mathematical truth of it. But samiyat, on the other hand, is information you could never, ever figure out on your own.
Like literally impossible to just guess.
Right, unless someone explicitly told you. These are things transmitted through hearing, so like the specific granular details of the afterlife.
Or the names of angels.
Yes, or the events of the Day of Judgment. I mean, no amount of sitting in a room thinking about math is going to reveal the name of an angel to you.
No, you need revelation for that. You need the text.
Exactly. But the problem arises when those two realms overlap.
Oh, this is where it gets messy.
Very messy. Yeah. What happens when a religious text, so a transmission from the Samiyat, makes a claim that appears to directly contradict the logical laws established by the Akliyat?
Right, the 2 + 2 = 5 scenario.
Yes. And the Maturidi school established a very strict rule of engagement for this exact scenario. According to our sources, their rule dictates that when revelation appears to contradict logical reason, reason must take precedence.
Wow.
Yeah. In their framework, reason is deemed the root and revelation is considered the branch.
Okay, that's huge. So the human mind gets the ultimate right of way.
That's the rule.
If the text says something that my rational mind categorizes as impossible, the text has to yield. But wait, they still believe the text is divine, right?
Oh, absolutely. They believe it's divine revelation.
So they can't just throw the parchment in the fire. How do they handle the actual words on the page if they've already decided, that the literal meaning is logically void?
Well, they developed two primary mechanisms to neutralize that friction. And the first is tawil.
Tawil.
Yeah, which essentially means metaphorical interpretation. It's diverting a word away from its apparent, literal, commonly understood meaning to a secondary meaning.
So a meaning that the intellect deems logically acceptable.
Exactly. And the second mechanism is tafweed.
Tafweed, right.
This involves reading the text, acknowledging the words are there, but consigning the true meaning entirely to God while completely denying the literal meaning.
I want to pause on tafweed for a second because the psychology of that is it's fascinating.
It's very unique.
If I read a sentence, my brain automatically processes the meaning of the words. It takes active, exhausting cognitive effort to read a word and force my brain to say, I see the letters, but I refuse to understand the concept they represent.
It's a mental block.
Yeah. Why on earth would they force themselves into that kind of cognitive dissonance?
Well, the motivation behind it is a profound, almost existential fear of something called tashbih.
Which means resembling creation, right?
Right, anthropomorphism. The Maturidists were utterly terrified of reducing God to human terms.
Yeah.
The sources explain that if a sacred text says God has a hand, the immediate automatic human response is to imagine a physical hand.
Naturally.
But logically, a physical hand implies a body. A body is made of composite parts, it takes up physical space, and it degrades over time.
All of which are characteristics of a created finite being.
Exactly, not an eternal, infinite creator.
Okay, so I see the anxiety there. To protect the majesty of God, which the texts call panzeia, they feel they have to actively intercept the text before the human mind can even form a physical image.
They have to cut it off at the pass.
Right. So using tawil, if the text says hand, they intercept it and say, no, it actually means power or blessing. The literal meaning is discarded for a rationalized abstraction.
That's tawil in action.
And then using tafweed, they say, the text says hand, we have absolutely no idea what that means, but we guarantee it doesn't mean anything close to a physical hand.
That is the exact mechanism. But let's look at the source text's reaction to this, because the critique here is pretty devastating.
Oh, yeah. The source does not hold back.
Not at all.
Okay.
The source argues that this methodology, elevating human reason to the supreme judicial seat over divine revelation, it fundamentally destroys the communicative power of language itself.
Which makes sense. I mean, think about it. If I write you a letter saying, I walked to the store, and you read it but decide, based on your own internal logic, that it's impossible for me to walk.
Right, because you live too far away or whatever.
Yeah. So you decide that walked must secretly mean thought about. Are you even reading my letter anymore?
No, you're not.
Or are you just reading your own mind projected onto my paper?
The source text makes that exact point. It argues that by constantly interpreting texts metaphorically through tile wheel, you strip the sacred texts of their actual intended meaning. Because if words don't mean what words mean, revelation ceases to be a communication. It becomes an encrypted puzzle where the reader has to constantly guess what the divine author actually meant behind this veil of metaphor.
It also assumes a massive level of hubris, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it sort of implies that the divine author wasn't articulate enough to explain things properly, so this 10th century human philosopher has to step in and fix the phrasing.
That's a powerful way to look at it. And the critique goes even further, placing this methodology in some very specific historical crosshairs.
Oh, the historical comparisons.
Yeah. The source text argues that by making reason the root and revelation the branch, the Maturidists are mirroring the approaches of much older scholastic groups, specifically the Jamia and the Mu'tazila.
And for anyone familiar with early Islamic history, those names carry massive weight.
Huge weight. The Mu'tazila were a rationalist group that the Orthodox scholars heavily and sometimes violently opposed. So by tying the Maturidists to them, the source text is framing this elevation of reason as a really dangerous departure from orthodoxy.
So what did the early Orthodox scholars do? The Salaf, as the text calls them. When they read the word hand, did they just accept that God is a giant human in the sky? Because that seems logically problematic too.
According to the source text, the Salaf had a fundamentally different paradigm. They accepted the texts literally, just as they were transmitted.
Okay, literally.
Yes, they affirmed the word hand without distorting it, without diverting it to power, and without pretending they didn't know what the word meant.
But how do they avoid the anthropomorphism?
This is the crucial pivot. They simultaneously maintained that God's attributes are entirely unlike human attributes. They would say, we affirm the hand, but its reality is nothing like a human hand, and we don't try to mentally construct how it works.
Oh, I see. So they just held the tension.
Exactly.
They didn't feel the need to solve the mystery by changing the vocabulary.
They believed the language provided by the divine text was exactly the language meant to be used. The source argues that the maturity approach lacks any consistent objective rule for interpretation.
Because reason is subjective.
Exactly. If you allow reason to override the text, the immediate question becomes, whose reason? Reason isn't a monolith.
Right. What one philosopher finds logically impossible, another might perfectly sound.
It creates a fluid hierarchy where human philosophy is constantly auditing and redacting revelation.
Which means the ultimate authority isn't the book on the table, it's the brain inside the skull of the person reading it.
Precisely.
And if theology becomes this elite, highly intellectualized exercise in logic and epistemology, that raises a massive problem for normal people.
A huge problem.
Because if the Maturidists believe that logical deduction is the ultimate key to understanding God, what happens to the person who isn't a philosopher?
This brings us to a really fascinating dilemma in the sources. The problem of the muqallid.
The muqallid, the imitator.
Yes. This is one of the most compelling ethical tensions in the entire maturity system. A muqallid is someone who believes in God and their religion purely because they were taught to do so by their parents, their teachers, or their society.
So they believe through socialization.
Right, imitation.
Yeah.
They have never sat down and independently verified their faith using rigorous logical proofs.
So basically 99.9% of all human beings who have ever lived.
Pretty much.
People who just inherit their worldview from their environment.
Well, the maturity stance on the muqallid is incredibly strict. They concede that the faith of the imitator is technically valid, meaning they are officially considered a believer.
Okay, so they aren't kicked out.
No, but the maturists consider this person to be actively sinning.
Wait, slow down. They are sinning just by believing what their parents taught them, even if what their parents taught them happens to be the correct theology.
Yes.
Wow.
According to the epistemological framework detailed in the sources, they are committing a sin because they are failing to use their intellect to independently, logically deduce the existence of God.
That is wild.
In the Maturidi view, reason is not just a helpful tool. It is the primary, mandatory instrument given by God to recognize him. If you fail to utilize that tool, if you just ride the coattails of your community's belief, you are engaging in profound spiritual negligence.
So for them, the intellect is a strict duty, not a luxury.
Exactly.
Okay, Liv, put this in the context of the real world back then. Because you have to think about an illiterate farmer living 1,000 years ago.
Right.
This person is working from sunrise to sunset in the dirt just to keep their children from starving. They pray, they believe in God, they try to be honest. Is it genuinely fair or even logically coherent to expect that exhausted farmer to sit down by candlelight and work out a multi-step Aristotelian philosophical proof for a prime mover before their faith is considered sinless?
Sounds like a stretch.
It feels absurdly elitist.
Yeah.
It turns theology into a country club where only the academics with free time get VIP status.
And you've hit the nail on the head because the source text zeroes in on that exact socioeconomic and practical absurdity.
Did they call it out?
Oh, absolutely. The critique presented in our sources argues that the Maturidi stance is built on a fundamentally flawed premise. The premise that complex logical deduction is the absolute root of valid faith.
Right.
The source points out that this scholastic requirement forces everyday people to engage in philosophical gymnastics that the Prophet of Islam never demanded of his early followers.
Right. If you look at the historical texts, you don't see the early generations handing out logic puzzles or epistemology quizzes before letting someone join the community.
No, they do.
They just ask for a simple declaration of faith.
Then the source text highlight the tragic irony in the Maturidi approach here. The Maturidists instituted this strict rule against imitation because they wanted a society of rational, independent, critical thinkers. They hated blind faith.
Which is a noble goal.
It is. But the source argues that by enforcing these highly convoluted intellectual prerequisites, they inadvertently created the exact blind imitation they were trying to cure.
Because the arguments were just too dense for the average person to actually comprehend?
Exactly. The philosophical proofs regarding bodies, accidents, and origination, which we'll get into, were so dense that the average merchant or farmer couldn't possibly formulate them independently.
So what happened?
The common people just ended up blindly imitating the complex arguments of the Maturidi scholars themselves.
Oh, man.
They memorized the philosophical jargon without truly understanding it, simply substituting one form of imitation for another.
It's like trying to cure someone of blindly trusting a doctor by forcing them to blindly memorize a medical textbook they don't understand.
That's a perfect analogy.
It doesn't solve the problem, it just changes the vocabulary of the problem.
And the source argues this approach complicates what was meant to be a simple, innate, natural disposition toward faith.
The fitra, right?
Yes, the fitra. By insisting on elite epistemology, they erected an artificial, purely human barrier to simple faith.
And if faith is defined as this highly intellectualized, purely rational deduction, that sets up our next major question.
Which is,
what happens when a believer does something utterly irrational? Like, if the Maturidis believe it's a sin just to inherit your faith without logical proof, how on earth do they judge someone who commits an actual physical crime, like theft or murder?
Yes.
Does a logically deduced faith just shatter the moment a person commits a major sin?
That question regarding the major sinner was one of the most explosive debates in early Islamic history. I mean, it literally tore communities apart.
I can imagine.
The Maturidi school developed a very precise, carefully quarantined answer to this. Assuming the believer who commits the major sin does not believe this sin itself is lawful.
Meaning, they know stealing is wrong, but they do it anyway out of greed or weakness.
Right, exactly. If that's the case, the Maturidi position is that this person does not exit the fold of Islam. They are still considered a believer with complete, entirely intact faith.
Complete faith. I want to make sure I'm hearing that right.
Yes, complete faith.
A person can commit murder, and their faith is still considered complete. How do they justify that mechanistically?
They justify it through their incredibly strict, narrow definition of what faith actually is. For the Maturidists, faith is defined almost exclusively by a term called tasdeeq.
Tasdeeq?
Yes, which translates to internal affirmation. It is the steadfast, intellectual belief residing purely in the heart and mind. Sometimes they include verbal affirmation on the tongue, but the core engine is that internal assent.
Okay, so it's all internal.
Entirely. Because faith is locked away in the vault of the heart as a matter of pure belief. Outward physical actions, whether they are incredible acts of charity or horrific sins, are entirely separated from the core definition of faith.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, the sinner still has perfect tasdik. They haven't logically stopped believing in God, but they are classified as a fasik.
A fasik, what does that mean?
It means rebellious or disobedient.
Yeah.
And as a fasik, they are subject to the threat of divine punishment. Their actions are terrible, but their membership status in the faith remains completely unblemished.
I've used this analogy before, but it feels so relevant here. It's exactly like having a gym membership.
Oh, go on.
You can be the absolute worst member of the gym. You never touch a barbell, you never get on a treadmill, and you just sit in the lobby eating donuts every single day.
Sounds like a great gym, honestly.
Right. But you are failing completely at the entire physical purpose of the gym. But as long as you believe the gym exists and your dues are paid in the system, your membership card still swipes at the door.
That's right.
You haven't been kicked out of the club, even if your physical actions are in total contradiction to the club's mission.
To take your gym analogy a step further, the historical context explains why they built the gym that way in the first place.
Defensive measures.
Yes.
Sure.
The Maturidists were reacting defensively against radical extremist groups in early Islamic history, specifically groups like the Kharijites.
The Kharijites.
The Kharijites would literally excommunicate and wage war against people for committing sins, claiming those sinners were no longer Muslims and therefore their blood was lawful.
Wow, so that's a terrifying extreme.
Exactly. So by drawing this hard, impenetrable line between internal belief tasdik and outward action, the Maturidists created a sociological firewall.
Oh, that makes total sense.
It prevented radical factions from kicking flawed, normal human beings out of the community. It provided a desperately needed stability. If faith is purely internal, no human can judge another human's faith based on outward mistakes.
Which makes total sense from a community preservation standpoint. I mean, you don't want a society where people are running around canceling each other's faith over every human failure. It would be absolute chaos.
Complete chaos.
But our source text is coming from a very specific theological angle. How does the source text respond to the donut eater in the gym? Because you can't just firewall your heart off from your actions without some kind of theological consequence.
The source text levels a major critique against this exact separation. The source argues that by defining faith only as internal belief in the heart, the Maturidists are departing from the established Orthodox view.
What's the Orthodox view according to the text?
According to the text, the Orthodox view is that faith is not a static binary. It's not just an on-off switch. It is a holistic, living combination of belief in the heart, words on the tongue, and physical actions of the limbs.
So actions are baked into the definition.
Yes. Therefore, in the Orthodox view, faith naturally increases and decreases. Good physical deeds actively increase the quantity and quality of internal faith. Sins actively decrease it.
So the source is arguing that the physical act actually shapes the biological reality of belief.
That's a great way to put it.
To stick with the gym, if you never lift a weight, your muscles actually atrophy. Your faith muscle shrinks. You can't separate the physical act from the internal reality because they are part of the same organism.
That's exactly how they see it. The critique is that reducing faith to a static switch ignores the reality of the human condition.
But do they agree on anything regarding the sinner?
They do. The source notes an area of vital agreement regarding ultimate accountability. The source points out that while the Maturidists keep the sinner in the club as a believer, they do not grant them a free pass.
Okay.
The Maturidists firmly affirm that the fasik, the rebellious believer, faces the ultimate consequences of their actions under God's will in the afterlife. God may choose to punish them, or he may choose to forgive them. The threat of consequence remains, even if the definition of faith has been structurally isolated.
Okay, so we've looked at how they override texts with logic, how they demand logical proof from the average person, and how they protect the faith status of the sinner.
Yes, quite a foundation.
Now we have to look at the absolute peak of their theological architecture. This is where the heavy philosophical machinery really gets put to work. How do the Maturidists actually define oneness, and how do they try to mathematically prove that God exists?
The concept of oneness is the gravitational center of all Islamic theology. It is known as Tawhid.
Tawhid.
However, the source text notes a very specific focus within the Maturidi school. They interpret Tawhid primarily and almost exclusively as Tawhid al-Rububiyyah.
Let's define that term clearly for everyone listening.
Tawhid al-Rububiyyah translates to the oneness of lordship, or the oneness of creation. It is the core belief that God is one in his pure essence, that he has no physical parts or divisions, and most importantly, that he has absolutely no partner in the act of creating, sustaining, and managing the universe.
He's the solo architect.
He is the sole, supreme architect and the singular prime mover.
So their main theological goal is proving that there is only one creator and logically forcing a skeptic to admit that this creator actually exists.
That is the goal.
And they use these massive, complex proofs to do it. The sources detail two major ones. I want to spend some real time on the first one because it is the cornerstone of their whole logical system, the Dalil al-Huduth.
The proof of origination.
Right. Break this down for me because this is where the Greek influence really takes the steering wheel, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Dalil al-Huduth is an elegant, highly structured, and rigid cosmological argument. It is designed as a trap to force any rational mind into a logical corner where they must admit a prime mover exists.
Okay, I love a good logical trap. Walk me through it.
The logic flows through several strict, sequential steps borrowed heavily from Aristotelian concepts of substance. Step 1. They look at the observable universe and state that the entire physical world is made up of two things: bodies and accidents.
Bodies and accidents. Okay, a body is a physical entity that takes up space and has dimension, right?
Exactly. And an accident is not a mistake in philosophical terms. It means the characteristics, qualities, or states that occur within or upon those bodies.
Okay, give me a concrete example. If I'm holding an apple.
The apple itself, its physical mass taking up space in your hand, is the body. The accidents are its redness, its roundness, its temperature, or the fact that it is currently resting in your hand rather than falling to the floor.
Oh, I see.
Redness cannot exist on its own floating in the void. It must happen to a body.
Okay, got it. Bodies are the hardware. Accidents are the software running on them. What's step 2?
Step 2. They observe that these bodies and their accidents are in a constant, unending state of change.
Like the apple ripening.
Exactly. The apple ripens from green to red. It falls from the tree, changing from motion to rest. It rots. It moves from one state to another continuously.
Makes sense.
Step 3 is the logical pivot. Whatever is subject to change is, by definition, subject to time. Change inherently requires a sequence, a before state, and an after state. You cannot have change without time.
Wait, slow down right there. So they are saying that because the redness of the apple changes to brown, that proves the apple is bound by linear time. I follow that. But how does that bridge to proving the universe had a definitive beginning? I'm missing the leap there.
That leads to step 4, which addresses your exact question. Anything that is subject to sequential time, anything that experiences a sequence of changing states, must have a beginning. It cannot be eternal in the past.
But why not? Why couldn't the universe just be an infinite chain of changes going back forever and ever?
Because of the philosophical impossibility of an infinite regression.
Okay, unpack that.
If the past is an infinite sequence of events, you could never actually arrive at the present moment. It's like trying to jump out of a bottomless pit. If there is no bottom to push off from, you can never reach the top.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the chains of past events must be finite. It must have started at a point zero. Therefore, whatever changes is not eternal. It is originated or created.
It's like dominoes. You have to have a first domino to knock the rest down.
Precisely. Which brings us to step 5, the grand conclusion. Whatever is originated must have an originator. A creation requires a creator.
Right.
Since the entire universe is made of bodies and accidents constantly changing, the entire universe is originated. Therefore, a creator of the universe must exist. And that creator is God.
That is incredibly satisfying. It's like watching a line of dominoes fall perfectly into place. Bodies change. Change requires time. Time requires a finite beginning. A finite beginning requires a beginner. Boom. God exists.
It's an incredibly satisfying rational framework if you accept the premises.
But wait, that just proves a creator exists. How do they prove there's only one? I mean, polytheism was a massive historical reality. There could be a committee of creators.
To dismantle the idea of a committee, they employ their second major argument, Dalil al-Tamanu, or the proof of mutual prevention.
Mutual prevention.
Yes. This is a brilliant thought experiment designed to prove that the concept of multiple gods inevitably collapses into a logical paradox.
Okay, lay it on me.
They argue. Suppose there were two gods. Because they are two distinct beings, they must have distinct independent wills.
Naturally.
If they have independent wills, it is logically possible for them to disagree. So imagine a scenario where God A wants to move a massive rock and God B wants that exact same rock to stay perfectly still.
Oh, it's the classic unstoppable force meets an immovable object paradox.
Exactly.
The universe's logic simply breaks down if there are two steering wheels in the car. What actually happens to the rock in their thought experiment?
The Maturidists argue that logic dictates only three possible outcomes to this disagreement, and every single one of them destroys the concept of multiple gods.
Okay, outcome one.
Outcome one. Both gods succeed. The rock moves and stays still at the exact same time. This is a logical contradiction and a physical impossibility, so it cannot happen.
Yeah, that's just nonsense. Outcome two.
Outcome two. Both gods fail. The rock neither moves nor stays still, which again breaks the laws of reality, but more importantly, it means both beings were thwarted. If a being can be thwarted or neutralized, it is not all-powerful. If it is not all-powerful, it cannot be defined as God.
Wow, okay. And the third outcome?
Outcome three. One God succeeds and the other fails. The rock moves, meaning God A won. But this means God B was defeated and his will was overpowered. An overpowered being is, by definition, weak, dependent, and therefore not a God.
That is brilliant.
The conclusion is absolute. The only logical scenario that preserves the definition of an all-powerful sovereign deity is that there can only be one single uncontested will. There's only one God.
I mean, that is intellectually airtight. You can easily see why the Maturidi scholars felt so confident. They felt they had mathematically cornered the market on theology. They had built this unassailable fortress.
They certainly did.
But considering how the source text reacted to their interpretation of Scripture earlier, I can sense a massive counterattack coming.
Oh, you know it is.
Because the source hated when dense logic overrode simple faith. What is the source's critique of these elegant, perfectly structured mathematical proofs?
The source text delivers a massive, multi-layered critique that attempts to dismantle this entire architectural framework.
Where do they even start?
First and foremost, the source argues that these complex philosophical proofs, specifically the Dalil al-Huduth with its heavy reliance on Aristotelian bodies and accidents, are foreign, Greek-influenced innovations.
Ah, they're calling out the Greek connection.
Explicitly. The specific Arabic term used in the text is bida, which carries a heavily negative connotation of altering the religion.
So it's an innovation in a bad way.
Yes. The text asserts forcefully that the Prophet, his companions, and the early Muslims never used this kind of convoluted Greek logic to prove God's existence. The source argues that by obsessing over these complex proofs, the theologians actually made faith significantly harder and less accessible.
So they basically imported a foreign philosophical software to run the Islamic theological operating system. And the source text is arguing that it created a massive system crash for the average believer.
That is precisely the angle of the critique. The source quotes earlier Orthodox scholars who state that these logical gymnastics end up being a long, confusing, and ultimately unnecessary detour to arrive at a conclusion that is already perfectly obvious to human nature.
The fitra, again.
Exactly. The source argues that the existence of God is known innately through the fitra.
Great.
It doesn't require a 10-page cosmological proof about accidents and bodies to know that a building requires a builder.
But what about their focus on Tawhid al-Rububiyyah? The obsession with proving God is the one creator. Does the source have an issue with that goal? Because proving there is one creator seems like a pretty foundational starting point for any monotheistic religion.
The source absolutely agrees that God is the sole creator. However, the text points out a massive, almost fatal theological blind spot in the Maturidi focus.
What did they miss?
The source argues that by focusing entirely their massive intellectual machinery on proving God is the creator Rububiyyah, the Maturidists missed the ultimate primary purpose of the religious message.
Which is?
The source asserts that the core of revelation is not merely acknowledging a creator, but rather establishing Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship. It is about directing all acts of worship to God alone.
Okay, so not just acknowledging he exists, but actively worshiping him exclusively.
Right, and here is where the text makes a devastating historical point. It notes that even the ancient polytheists, the pagans in Mecca, who violently opposed the early prophets, they actually believed in a supreme creator God who made the heavens and the earth.
Wait, really?
Yes. Their primary sin wasn't denying the existence of the creator. Their sin was directing their worship, their prayers, and their sacrifices to idols alongside that creator.
Oh, wow. That changes everything. So the source is essentially saying to the Maturidists, congratulations, your massive, complex Greek philosophical proof. just successfully arrived at the exact same theological baseline that the ancient pagan idol worshippers already believed.
Exactly.
It proved a creator exists, but it entirely failed to address the actual functional purpose of the religion, which is exclusive worship and devotion.
Spot on.
That implies the Maturidists built a magnificent, impregnable fortress, but they built it on the entirely wrong battlefield.
That is exactly the implication. The source argues that they expended all their intellectual energy solving a problem that the prophets didn't consider the primary issue, while neglecting the core message the prophets actually came to deliver.
Man, that is a heavy critique.
It is. And this tension between philosophical logic and divine revelation, it reaches its absolute, most controversial apex when we look at the final section of our analysis today, the names and attributes of God.
Oh, right, where the fear of human resemblance meets the text head-on.
Exactly. How do you describe a being that is entirely beyond human comprehension without accidentally describing a human?
Right, the fleeing from human traits issue. We touched on this earlier with their fear of Tashbih making God resemble creation. How did the Maturidists apply this specific fear to the multitude of names and attributes explicitly mentioned in the sacred texts, like when the text repeatedly calls God the hearing or the seeing?
The maturity approach here is characterized by extreme caution and strict intellectual quarantines. They affirm the names of God, like the hearing or the seeing, because the revelation explicitly provided those words, and they can't simply delete text from the scripture.
Right, the words are there.
However, they systematically strip away any meaning from those attributes that might even remotely suggest Tashbih.
Okay, they empty the words out.
Furthermore, the source text points out a specific methodological quirk. The Maturidists do not differentiate between proper names like the merciful or the forgiving and what are merely informational descriptions or actions.
Like what?
Like describing God as a maker or ancient or thing. They lump them all together into one category, which the source text views as a severe linguistic and theological error.
Okay, let's unpack the psychology of this again, because it feels like trying to describe colors to someone who has been blind since birth.
Yes, very much so.
You have to use words, but the words are inevitably going to fall tragically short of the actual reality. You might say, you know, red is like heat, but red isn't actually heat at all. The Maturidi seems so terrified that if they say God sees, the uneducated masses will instantly imagine God with physical human eyeballs, retinas, and optic nerves, so they just empty the word sees of its normal functional meaning entirely.
That analogy perfectly captures the profound philosophical anxiety driving the maturity school. Because how can a finite, physical, time-bound human mind comprehend an infinite, transcendent being without accidentally shrinking that being down to a human size?
It's almost an impossible task.
Their solution was to erect these strict intellectual boundaries, heavily relying on ta'wil metaphor to reinterpret traits like seeing into something safely abstract, like knowledge. God doesn't see you in a visual sense. He merely knows you.
But here is where the source text delivers its final, most potent counterclaim, right?
It does.
Because the source argues that by trying so incredibly hard to purify God's image, which is the goal of Tanzia the Maturidis, inadvertently plunged straight into tatil.
Exactly.
Tatil. Let's define that clearly for the listeners.
Tatil means the emptying, stripping, or divesting of God's actual described attributes. The text argues that this fear of resembling creation is philosophically unfounded and logically lazy.
Lazy. Why lazy?
Because the source states that just because humans possess certain attributes like hearing, sight, or even existence, it does not necessitate that God's hearing or sight is anything remotely like a human's.
Oh, I see.
A human sight is weak, limited, physical, and dependent on photons of light entering a physical eye. God's sight is infinite, perfect, and uncreated. The source argues that you can fully, robustly affirm the attribute exactly as the text states it, while simultaneously completely denying any physical resemblance.
So they're purifying it so much they're bleaching it completely blank. The source is essentially saying, stop panicking. The language provided by the divine text is exactly the language meant to be used.
Precisely.
To go back to my color analogy, if the divine text says the color is red, the source is arguing we should just humbly accept it's red, even if our finite minds can't fully comprehend the perfect divine version of red, instead of using our limited human logic to say, well, red must actually mean warm.
That is the absolute crux of the al-Sunnah critique presented in the source. The source argues that overriding the explicit divine text with human logic assumes a staggering level of intellectual hubris.
It really does.
It assumes that the human mind knows better than the divine text how to properly describe the divine. It implies the revelation was poorly worded, dangerously misleading, and requires philosophers to constantly act as a PR team to fix it for the masses.
This has been a truly massive intellectual journey today. We have explored how the Maturidi theological school tried to build an ironclad, logically bulletproof system of faith. We saw how they elevated reason to the status of a judge when interpreting ancient texts.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We examined how they viewed the simple inherited faith of the common person as a sin, demanding logical proof instead. We saw how they handled the massive societal threat of the rebellious sinner by surgically separating outward actions from internal belief. And we unpacked how they constructed these brilliant, convoluted mathematical proofs for God's existence, heavily relying on Greek logic.
And throughout every single step, we examined how the provided source text heavily criticizes that entire system.
Right. Arguing that replacing simple, innate, text-based faith with overly complex philosophy strips the religion of its original meaning, mimics earlier controversial groups, and ultimately builds a theology that answers the wrong questions.
It is a perfect encapsulation of the eternal, ongoing struggle between the human mind and the sacred text. And I want to leave the listener with one final thought to ponder, something that builds on everything we dissected today.
Okay, I love a good final thought.
The Matridists relied heavily on the specific human logic and philosophical frameworks of their era, specifically Greek concepts of accidents, bodies, and sequential time to understand and prove eternal tests.
Yeah.
But what happens when human understanding of the physical universe fundamentally changes?
Oh, like a paradigm shift in science.
Exactly. If modern quantum physics or string theory or new cosmology completely upends our logical view of reality, proving that time isn't strictly sequential, or that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously, effectively breaking Aristotelian logic, does a theology built entirely on their older human logic have to be completely torn down and rewritten.
Oh, wow.
Whereas a theology built entirely on the literal text, unmoored from the constantly shifting sands of human science and philosophy, remains static and untouched.
That is a brilliant and slightly terrifying question to end on. Because if you anchor the absolute truth of your faith to the cutting-edge science and logic of the 10th century, what do you do when you wake up in the 21st century?
Exactly. You have to rebuild the whole house.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning assumptions, keep exploring the mechanics of how we believe what we believe, and we'll see next time you want to take a deep dive into the unknown. Remember, whether you are trusting the ancient text or trusting the logic in your brain, the ultimate truth is always out there, waiting to be unpacked.
Imagine for a second just a highly specific, rather localized philosophical framework.
Right.
We're talking about a niche way of seeing the universe, like a method of interpreting reality that started in a relatively small theological circle in Central Asia.
Okay.
Now imagine that localized framework is suddenly handed the keys to a sprawling multi-continental empire.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We're talking about unprecedented globe-spanning scale. How does a tight-knit group of intellectuals essentially become the architects of an empire's entire operating system?
That is the big question.
Right. So, welcome to a brand new deep dive.
Yay.
We're taking you on an intricate journey today into the explosive expansion, the eventual chaotic splintering, and the deeply controversial core philosophies of the Maturidi theological school.
And we're focusing on a very specific arc of that history today.
Yeah.
We aren't just looking at the founding moments. We are tracing the trajectory from its absolute peak, the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, down through its collapse, and then right into the grassroots, deeply fractured movements of the Indian subcontinent.
Which is fascinating all on its own.
It really is, but the history is really just the vehicle here. Ultimately, this all leads us to a fierce, centuries-old battle over epistemology.
Epistemology.
Right. It's basically a debate over how human beings can even claim to know the divine at all.
Like what gets the final say?
Exactly. Is it human intellect and rational deduction, or is it literal textual revelation?
Well, before we dive into the mechanics of that, and we will get into the weeds, we have to put our cards on the table regarding the documents we're analyzing today.
Definitely.
Because you've provided us with a stack of incredibly detailed source material. But this isn't, a neutral, distant history textbook.
No, not at all.
What we have here is a meticulous, highly critical review of the Maturidi school, written from a staunchly opposing, Salafi theological perspective.
Right. It's a very specific lens.
Exactly. And we are your impartial guides for this.
Yeah.
Our goal isn't to referee this centuries-old theological debate, right?
Yeah.
Nor are we, endorsing the critiques laid out in these pages.
Of course not.
Our mission is to unpack the original source material. We want to reconstruct the arguments being made, understand the historical triggers for those arguments, and figure out why this philosophical divide still dictates how millions of people practice their faith today.
Yeah, we really have to get inside the architecture of this intellectual rivalry.
Right.
And to do that effectively, we need to view the history through the lens of this specific critique.
So where do we start?
Well, we're going to look at the political machinery that enabled this theology to spread, how that machinery broke down and forced the theology to mutate in the modern era, and then wade into the incredibly deep waters of theology versus philosophy.
Let's start with the geopolitical jackpot.
Right.
We are moving past the early foundational years of the Maturidi school. Like back when its namesake, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, was a local scholar debating rival factions in Samarkand.
Mm-hmm. Right, the early days.
Yeah. Our source text points us toward what it calls the mother of all stages. We are looking at the era stretching from the 8th to the 14th Islamic centuries.
The Ottoman Empire.
Exactly, the Ottoman Empire. This is the absolute zenith of maturity influence.
It's the inflection point, really. It's where a theology stops being a debated set of ideas and solidifies into a massive institution.
Because of state backing.
Right. The catalyst for this, according to the text we're reading, is the Ottoman state's official adoption of the Hanafi school of jurisprudence.
Okay, we need to clarify the relationship here for anyone who isn't familiar.
Yeah, good idea. So jurisprudence, or fiqh, is the practical day-to-day legal side of the religion.
Rules.
Exactly. It covers how to pray, how to conduct a business transaction, how to get married.
Right.
Theology, on the other hand, or akida, is about the unseen, the nature of God, the afterlife.
Yeah.
And historically, the Hanafi legal school became inextricably linked to the Maturidi theological creed.
I always try to visualize how two separate disciplines fuse like that.
How do you mean?
Well, I'd assume the legal system and a theological system merge because they share a founder, or maybe because the state mandates them to be taught together.
Sure.
But looking at the timeline, it seems more symbiotic. Like, the Hanafi legal system was incredibly pragmatic, which is exactly what a rapidly expanding, diverse empire like the Ottomans needed to govern.
Absolutely.
And then the Maturidi theology provided a highly rationalized, structured backbone that appealed to the administrators of that empire.
That symbiosis is key. They functioned essentially as two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And the practical consequence of this union was monumental. Because the Ottoman Empire made Hanafi law the law of the land, the Maturidi creed didn't just piggyback on that expansion.
It was baked in.
Yes, it was woven into the very fabric of the state's administration.
Wow.
So wherever the empire's borders reached, stretching across the east, the west, Arab lands, parts of Persia, and deep into Turkey, that combined Hanafi maturity framework went right with it.
It's like a tech startup building a highly specific operating system.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, and instead of having to market it to individual users, a global monopoly simply pre-installs it on every single computer they manufacture.
That's exactly it.
The spread of the theology wasn't necessarily happening because millions of individual citizens were staying up late, independently researching philosophical arguments.
Right. They weren't actively choosing to download the maturity software, so to speak.
Exactly. It spread because it was the default infrastructure. If you bought the computer, it came with the OS. If you lived under Ottoman rule, your entire legal, educational, and civic framework was functioning on Hanafi maturity code.
And what shifts when that happens is the entire posture of the intellectual tradition.
How so?
Well, the source we are analyzing emphasizes the sheer volume of literature produced in this era.
Right.
See, when a school of thought is in its infancy, or when it's actively fighting for survival against rival sects, it's in a defensive posture. Scholars are writing polemics. They are trying to prove their legitimacy.
They're on the attack.
Exactly. But when you become the official state doctrine, you don't need to fight for survival anymore.
Because you've won.
Right. So your posture becomes bureaucratic. You begin codifying, organizing, and categorizing everything.
The source notes an almost unfathomable explosion in theological literature during this Ottoman stage.
It's massive.
But it wasn't necessarily new, groundbreaking philosophy, was it?
Not really, no.
It was more like an endless nesting doll of commentary. You'd have a foundational textbook from an early scholar.
Right.
Then, a generation later, an Ottoman scholar writes an extensive commentary on that textbook. Then, a century later, another scholar writes a commentary on the commentary, what they call a hashiyah.
And it doesn't stop there.
It doesn't.
No, you would have scholars writing footnotes on the hashiyah. You have to picture what these physical manuscripts actually looked like.
Okay, paint me a picture.
You would have the original core text in a small box in the center of the page. Surrounding that in a larger block is the commentary. And then filling the margins, written in tiny script, often diagonally to fit it all in, are the footnotes and the super commentaries.
That is just the ultimate manifestation of intellectual bureaucracy.
Totally.
You aren't arguing about the nature of God anymore. You are arguing about what a scholar from 300 years ago meant when he used a specific preposition to describe a previous scholar's interpretation of the nature of God.
Exactly. It creates a towering, almost impenetrable wall of text that requires a massive educational apparatus just to decipher.
And that apparatus was tied directly to state power.
Inherently. The Ottoman government was actively appointing judges, creating fatwa councils, and assigning leaders to major mosques.
Naturally, an administration functioning on Hanafi law is going to appoint Hanbali judges.
Right. And where are those judges trained?
In the state-sponsored madrasas.
Yes, the ones that teach Maturidi theology. It becomes a completely self-replicating system. The source even points out that during this massive Ottoman consolidation, the lines between the Maturidis and their historical theological cousins, the Ash'ari school, blurred so much that they almost function as a single, united theological front.
When you have that much power, you consolidate the market.
Right.
You just absorb your closest competitors.
Yeah.
But empires, no matter how vast, don't last forever.
They never do.
The geopolitical realities shift. And when the Ottoman infrastructure finally begins to fracture and collapse, this massive theological operating system doesn't just evaporate.
No, it has to adapt.
Right. The state funding dries up, the imperial judgeships disappear, and the theology is forced down to the grassroots level.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the 19th and 20th centuries, primarily focusing on the Indian subcontinent.
Let's get into that.
If the Ottoman era was characterized by centralizing and creating this united front, the post-imperial era is defined by intense, rapid splintering.
Let's stick with our tech analogy for a second. The global monopoly goes bankrupt. The central servers are shut down. Suddenly, this massive, complex operating system is forced to become open source.
I love that. Yeah.
You have all these different regional developers, in this case, charismatic scholars in the Indian subcontinent, taking the source code, patching it with local cultural software, and trying to build their own independent networks.
And because there is no central authority enforcing uniformity anymore, these different groups begin to fiercely compete for the exact same demographic base.
Right.
When we look at the source's breakdown of this era, we see a profound crisis of authority. The text highlights several key factions that emerged from this splintering.
And it critiques them heavily.
Very heavily.
Let's start with the Deobandi movement.
Yeah.
The text places its foundation around the Islamic year 1283, spearheaded by Muhammad Qasim Nanatawi.
Yes.
Now, the author of our source gives them their due in one specific area.
Right, acknowledging that the Deobandi scholars are absolute giants when it comes to the sciences of hadith.
Right, the preservation and study of the Prophet's traditions.
Yeah.
But from the Salafi perspective of our text, the praise stops right there.
It pivots sharply. The critique turns toward their strict adherence to the Hanaki and Maturidi framework, and more specifically, their integration of Sufi practices.
It was a huge point of contention.
Massive. In the context of the Indian subcontinent, the highly structured theology of the Maturidi school merged with the deeply ingrained mystical traditions of Indian Sufism.
Right.
The source views this integration as a complete corruption. It accuses the Deobandis of extreme partisanship to their legal school and notes a deeply entrenched hostility toward the group the author identifies as al-Sunnah.
Which, just to be clear, is the author's own Salafi tradition.
Exactly.
The source also drops a really fascinating detail here about export mechanisms. It mentions the Tablighi Jamaat.
Oh, yes.
For anyone who doesn't know, the Tablighi Jamaat is arguably one of the largest, if not the largest, grassroots Islamic preaching movements globally today. You see them everywhere, from rural villages in South Asia to major cities in Europe and North America. And our source explicitly links them as an offshoot of the Deobandi school.
They essentially act as the distribution network.
Right.
The Tablighi Jamaat takes the specific Hanafi Maturidi theological views, combined with the behavioral and spiritual ethos of the Deobandi movement, and packages it into a highly mobile, easily replicable preaching model.
It's genius, honestly.
It really is. It's how a regional splinter group from the subcontinent managed to regain a global footprint without needing an empire to back them.
But the Deobandis aren't the only players trying to claim the legacy.
No, not at all.
The text introduces the Barelvi stage, founded by Ahmad Raza Khan, and the tone of the critique escalates dramatically here.
It gets incredibly harsh.
The author doesn't just accuse them of extreme partisanship. The text levels accusations of overt polytheism or shirk and grave worship.
Which stems from the Barelvi emphasis on intercession and a very elevated, almost mystical veneration of saints and the prophet.
What is sociologically critical to understand here, and the text makes a point to highlight this, is the nature of the hostility.
Right.
The most bitter, intense excommunication isn't necessarily happening between these groups and completely outside religions.
No, the fiercest battles are internal.
Yeah.
The Barelvis and the Deobandis are locked in a deeply hostile, mutually excommunicating rivalry.
And then you have figures like Zahid al-Qathari, leading what the text calls the Qathari stage in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
Right.
According to the source, Qathari goes on the offensive, but he directs his attacks backward in time.
He does.
He begins aggressively critiquing early Islamic scholars and foundational Sunni texts, accusing them of being pagan or promoting anthropomorphism.
Which basically means describing God with human physical traits.
Right, and Qathari frames himself as the ultimate defender of the pure, rational Maturidi tradition against what he views as dangerous literalism.
When you look at the Deobandis, the Barelvis, and the Qatharis, you have to realize they all share the exact same intellectual DNA.
That's the crazy part.
They do. They all trace their lineage back to the Hanafi legal school. They all claim the Maturidi theological creed. They revere the same early texts.
So what causes a monolithic imperial school of thought to shatter so violently that its descendants are declaring each other heretics?
It's like a classic crisis of authority.
It feels like the narcissism of small differences amplified by a fight for survival.
That's exactly it. When the Ottoman state was dictating the theology, disagreements were handled bureaucratically. But in the subcontinent, without the unifying pressure of a central state, the theology had to adapt to local realities.
And it branched out.
Yeah. A scholar in one region might lean heavier into the mystical Sufi traditions to appeal to the local populace, while a scholar in another region might double down on strict Hadith scholarship to prove their authenticity.
Right.
Because they no longer have guaranteed state funding, they have to differentiate themselves to attract followers and resources. The infighting is so bitter precisely because they are fighting over who gets to claim the authentic mantle of the tradition.
They are fighting over who holds the copyright to the original source code.
Perfectly said.
Now, having zoomed out to see this massive historical sweep from the courts of Turkey to the local madrasas of India, we have to ask a purely mechanical question.
Okay, what's that?
How did they actually achieve this dominance in the first place? I mean, I might naturally assume that a theology spreads simply because it wins the marketplace of ideas.
Sure, people hear the arguments and agree.
Right. People hear the philosophical arguments in the town square and collectively agree, yes, this makes the most logical sense. But the text points to a much more structural, almost cynical reality, doesn't it?
Oh, it points entirely to structure. Ideas do not survive on merit alone.
Right.
They require architecture. The source actually provides a very clear four-phase playbook for how this ideological spread occurred.
Break that down for us.
So phase one is foundation. That's the early period of surviving and establishing core arguments against rival sects.
Okay.
Phase two is formation, where the original founder students begin traveling to disseminate the teachings.
Makes sense.
Phase three is compilation. This is where the arguments are formalized into standard textbooks and curriculum.
Right. The bureaucracy starts.
Exactly. And finally, phase four is expansion.
But the real engine driving that expansion phase is summarized in the text with a brilliant sociological concept it calls the rule of kings.
Yes. The source quotes the renowned Indian scholar Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, as well as the medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah.
And the premise is brutally pragmatic. People follow the religion of their kings.
It strips away all the romanticism of intellectual history, doesn't it?
Completely.
The text argues that the success of a school of thought isn't just about having the sharpest syllogism. When the ruling authority adopts a specific school and subsequently controls the appointments of judges, funds the educational endowments, and dictates the talking points for Friday's sermons, that school flourishes.
It becomes the water the society swims in.
Exactly. Conversely, if a brilliant theology is ignored or actively suppressed by the state, it withers into obscurity.
It makes perfect sense. If you
Yeah.
want to change the mind of a society, you don't waste your time debating individual citizens on street corners.
No, you take over the institutions.
Right. You take over the institutions that train the teachers,
Yeah.
and you control the courtrooms that dictate the laws.
Which leads directly into the second major structural mechanism the text identifies,
The madrasa
a
factor.
madrasa factory. Let's look at the establishment of massive educational hubs, like the famous Darul Uloom Deoband University.
Oh.
The source describes these institutions essentially as ideological assembly lines. They aren't just teaching generic literacy, they are highly specialized farms.
We're farms.
Yeah, they plant the very specific seeds of maturity theology, nurture thousands of students within that exact intellectual paradigm, and then export those graduates across the globe to build satellite schools and continue the cycle.
They built an infrastructure that could outlast the empire.
Precisely. The Ottomans gave them the initial global reach, but the madrasa system gave them self-sustaining momentum. They institutionalized their way of thinking.
And that phrase, their way of thinking, brings us to the beating heart of this entire deep dive.
Here we go.
We've spent all this time talking about how they amassed this immense institutional power spanning centuries and continents to enforce their worldview.
Right.
But we haven't actually dissected the worldview itself. What is the core philosophical disagreement that the Salafi author of our source is so passionately arguing against?
This is the big one.
This brings us to the most controversial aspect of the Maturidi school, their methodology regarding how humans can actually know God. We are entering the epistemological battlefield of intellect versus revelation, Akil versus Knock.
This is where the profound theological friction occurs.
Right.
The source outlines that the maturity framework fundamentally divides theology into two distinct categories.
Two buckets.
Right. The first category is rational matters, things governed by human intellect, or akil.
Okay.
The second category is transmitted matters, things governed by revelation, scripture, or nakul.
And the critical move the Maturidists make is deciding which bucket the concept of God goes into.
Exactly.
They assert that matters regarding the core nature and attributes of God fall almost entirely into the rational bucket.
Yeah. Their premise is that God endowed human beings with intellect, and that this intellect is fundamentally capable of and required to logically deduce the existence, the perfection, and the necessary attributes of God.
So reason is the judge.
Right. Therefore, human reason serves as the primary, foundational judge when determining what can and cannot be true about the divine.
I mean, I can see the philosophical appeal of that. It places a massive premium on human reasoning.
It does.
But here is the conflict that our source text zeroes in on. What happens when the two systems collide?
That's the friction.
What happens when a scriptural text like a literal verse from the Quran or an authenticated hadith from the Prophet appears to contradict what the maturity scholars have deemed to be purely rational?
According to the maturity framework, if the transmitted text, the naqal, clashes with the intellect, the akil, the intellect must prevail.
Intellect wins.
Always. They argue that reason is definitive, while textual language can be ambiguous or metaphorical. Therefore, the text cannot be accepted literally.
It has to be reinterpreted.
Yes, it must be subjected to a process of heavy reinterpretation, a process known as ta'wil.
The source gives some very specific lightning rod examples to illustrate this.
It does.
In the religious texts, there are verses that explicitly mention God's hand or refer to God's establishment on the throne.
Right.
If I'm a maturity philosopher, reading those literal words through the lens of pure logic triggers a massive system error.
Because of the implications. The maturity philosopher argues, if God possesses a literal hand, that implies God is a physical entity, a body.
And physical bodies have parts.
Exactly. Physical bodies are composed of parts. Anything composed of parts is, by definition, created, limited, and dependent on something else to assemble it. Therefore, it is rationally, mathematically impossible for the eternal, uncreated, limitless God to have a physical body. Because their intellect has established this impossibility, they cannot accept the literal word hand. They must deploy ta'wil.
So they look at the word hand in the scripture, and they conceptually patch it. They interpret it metaphorically to mean power or blessing.
Right.
They look at the phrase establishment on the throne, and they reinterpret it to mean greatness, dominion, or control. Their ultimate goal is protective, right? They're trying to insulate the concept of God from anthropomorphism, from being reduced to a magnified human being.
But the author of our source attacks this entire methodology with blistering intensity.
Really blistering.
The Salafi critique argues that this approach dangerously subverts the proper order of reality. The author insists that human reason is inherently flawed, culturally subjective, and severely limited.
So reason has to submit.
Therefore, reason must always submit to divine revelation, not the other way around. If the divine text describes God as having a hand, the Salafi perspective demands that you accept it as a reality.
You affirm it.
You affirm it without comparing it to a human hand, without asking how it functions, and crucially, without twisting the linguistic meaning of the word to mean power.
Let me try to put an analogy to this because it's a dense conflict.
Please do.
Imagine a team of human engineers receives a highly complex definitive user manual directly from the manufacturer of a completely revolutionary alien piece of technology.
Okay, I'm with you.
But instead of just following the manual, the engineers insist on filtering the instructions through their own earthly, pre-existing philosophy of how machines should operate.
Right.
The manual explicitly says, turn the blue gear. But the engineers look at it and say, well, rationally speaking, a machine of this advanced perfection wouldn't use something as crude and mechanical as a gear. That makes no sense to our understanding of physics.
So they changed the meaning.
Exactly. Therefore, the word gear must actually be a metaphor for energy flux. They rewrite the manual based on their own limited capacity to understand the engineering. That is exactly how the author of our source views the Maturidi practice of Tawil.
It perfectly captures the critique, and it highlights one of the oldest tensions in religious history.
The boundary line of the human mind.
Exactly. The Maturidists are terrified of anthropomorphism. They believe elevating reason is the only way to protect the transcendent majesty of God.
Right.
The author of our source, conversely, is terrified of philosophical arrogance. The critique argues that elevating a human being's logical deductions above the direct, literal words of the divine leads to a slippery slope where you twist the text beyond recognition.
It is a dangerous path.
To the author, if you start declaring that hand actually means power, where does the metaphor stop? You eventually end up worshiping a philosophical abstraction, a sterile energy flux, rather than the personal God who actually revealed himself through the text.
It is fundamentally a battle over who holds the red pen. Who gets the final edit? The human philosopher mapping out logic, or the literal text delivered by the prophet?
That's the core of it.
And this framework of elevating human reason doesn't just apply to interpreting vocabulary words. It bleeds directly into how they handle the physical historical transmission of the texts themselves.
Right, the actual text.
This brings us to a highly technical and fiercely contested segment of our source material. The controversy over Ahad Hadiths.
To really grasp the weight of this debate, we have to define the terminology of Islamic transmission.
Yes, let's do that. What exactly is an Ahad Hadith?
In the science of hadith, an Ahad narration is a solitary report. It is a statement or action of the prophet that has been rigorously investigated and authenticated by scholars.
So it's authentic.
Yes, but, and this is the crucial distinction, it was only transmitted by a very small number of individuals, perhaps just one or two companions, at that initial first generation.
And that is in contrast to a mutawatir hadith, right?
Right.
Which is a mass-transmitted report. A mutawatir hadith was witnessed and passed down by so many independent people in so many different locations that scholars deem it mathematically and logically impossible for them to have all colluded to fabricate a lie.
Precisely. So you have an Ahad Hadith, a statement from the Prophet. The chain of narrators is solid, the individuals are deemed trustworthy, but only one person heard the Prophet say it initially.
Okay.
Because it is a solitary report, the Maturidi scholars categorize it differently. They state that an Ahad Hadith only provides probability.
Probability.
The Arabic term used is zan. It means it is highly probable that the Prophet said it, but because humans can make mistakes, a solitary report cannot provide 100% absolute, airtight mathematical certainty, which is known as yaqeen.
And this is where the Maturidi ruling sets off alarms for the author of our source.
Major alarms.
The Maturidists dictate that because ahad hadiths only yield probability, they
Right.
cannot be used to establish core theological beliefs. They cannot be used to construct your akidah, your foundational creed.
Right.
You can absolutely use an ahad hadith to determine practical legal rulings, how to perform a specific prayer, how to wash, how to execute a business contract. But you cannot use it to define the attributes of God or the unseen realities of the afterlife.
For theology, the Maturidists demand absolute certainty. You must have mass-transmitted texts or undeniable rational proofs.
The source violently rejects this premise.
Oh, completely. The text goes on a major offensive here, arguing that throwing out ahad hadiths in matters of theology aligns the Maturidists with deviant, hyper-rationalist sects from early Islamic history, like the Mutazilites.
Wow.
And the author attempts to dismantle the Maturidi logic by pointing out what they view as a glaring historical contradiction.
The source uses a very specific historical example from the Prophet's own life to make this point.
Yes, the author points out that during his lifetime, the Prophet frequently sent solitary companions, single individuals, like Mu'adh bin Jabal, to distant lands, like Yemen. Why was Mu'adh sent? He wasn't just sent to teach them how to wash for prayer. He was sent to teach entire populations the core tenets of the Islamic faith. He was sent to teach them theology.
And the author's argument is, if a single, solitary person's report wasn't enough to establish absolute certainty in matters of creed, why would the Prophet himself rely on a solitary individual to convert an entire nation?
Exactly. The author argues that if the Maturidi rule regarding ahad hadiths were actually true, the Prophet's own diplomatic and educational actions wouldn't make logical sense.
Right.
Furthermore, the Salafi perspective argues that when these solitary reports are authenticated and combined with other contextual evidences within the religion, they do in fact provide absolute certainty. The text is demanding that authenticity equals authority, regardless of the math of how many people initially heard it.
I understand the author's critique, but I want to interject and push back on this for a moment.
Okay, go ahead.
When you lay out the Maturidi position regarding probability versus certainty, doesn't it actually make a profound amount of practical sense?
How do you mean?
Let's use a modern legal analogy. In a criminal court, you would never sentence someone to life in prison or hand down the death penalty based on the testimony of just one single witness who says, yeah, I'm pretty sure I saw him do it.
Right, you need more than that.
The standard for taking a human life is beyond a reasonable doubt. You need corroboration. If the stakes are that rigorously high for a temporary human life, shouldn't the bedrock of your eternal cosmic faith require the highest possible standard of proof? Shouldn't a theology demand mass-transmitted, undeniable certainty before it etches an idea into its core creed?
It is an incredibly compelling argument, and you have just perfectly articulated the defensive instinct of the Maturidi school.
Thank you.
They aren't trying to discard the Prophet's words. They are trying to build an impenetrable, intellectually rigorous fortress around the core of the faith.
Exactly.
They want to protect the theology from weak, misunderstood, or potentially fabricated transmissions entering the system. They view their standard as the ultimate intellectual diligence.
Right. They want the structural integrity of the theology to be flawless.
Yeah.
So how does the Salafi critique in our source counter that specific logic of protecting the creed?
The counter-argument focuses on the devastating cost of that skepticism.
The cost.
The source emphasizes that if you systematically discard all ahad hadiths from your theology simply because they don't meet an impossibly high philosophical standard of mathematical certainty, you are forced to discard massive foundational portions of established Islamic belief.
Because so much of the detailed information about the unseen comes from these solitary reports.
Exactly. Intricate details about the Day of Judgment, the nature of angels, the specific attributes of God, the events of the afterlife. Many of these concepts are found primarily in authentic ahad reports.
Oh.
The author's critique is that by demanding this philosophical definition of certainty, the Maturidists are essentially allowing human skepticism to override and delete the authentic prophetic tradition.
That's a heavy accusation.
To the author, it is a theological tragedy to have an authentic, vetted statement from the Prophet in your hands and to dismiss it from your core belief system because your philosophical rulebook says it's merely probable.
Right.
The Salafi perspective posits that if the transmission is authentically traced back to the Prophet, it is certain to because the divine guarantees the preservation of the religion.
It is a massive, incredibly high-stakes intellectual tightrope. On one side, you risk building your eternal faith on a solitary human error.
Yes.
On the other side, You risk systematically deleting the Prophet's actual teachings because they don't cleanly pass through your philosophical filter.
Exactly.
It really illuminates why these debates were never just academic exercises discussed over tea. These were battles over the very fabric of reality, truth, and salvation.
And it is precisely that tension, the friction between the human desire to logically organize and categorize the universe and the religious imperative to submit unconditionally to revealed text that drove this entire history.
It's all connected.
That tension is what propelled the Maturidi school to build a towering bureaucracy during the Ottoman Empire, and it is the exact same tension that fueled the bitter splintering and infighting in the madrasas of India centuries later.
Which brings us full circle. We have traced an incredible lineage of thought today.
We really have.
We watched a specific framework operate as the centralized software of the Ottoman courts. We saw it fracture into fiercely competitive open-source movements in the Indian subcontinent.
Right.
And we drilled all the way down into the foundational philosophical rift. The battle over whether our brains or our books should be the ultimate arbiter of the divine.
We've looked at how political power can institutionalize a theology, how the vacuum of that power creates ideological chaos, and how a seemingly abstract debate about intellect versus revelation dictates the worldview of millions.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time dissecting how the Maturidists built a global theological empire on the premise that human reason must serve as the ultimate filter for divine truth. They use their intellect to translate and interpret the text.
Right.
But here's the catch. Human reason is not a static, unmoving constant.
No, it isn't.
What is considered perfectly rational or logically necessary changes depending on the century you are born in, the culture that raises you, and the specific philosophers you happen to read.
Absolutely.
If we decide that our human intellect always gets the final edit over the literal text, how do we ever ensure that we are actually discovering the divine, rather than just projecting our own era's logic and our own generational biases onto the heavens?
It ultimately comes down to a question of exactly where we place our humility.
Absolutely. Thank you, as always, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope we've given you a shortcut to being deeply well-informed about a complex, fascinating piece of intellectual history. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you on the next deep dive. If you pick up a holy book, right, like any sacred text that claims to be the ultimate absolute truth from a higher power, who is actually reading it?
That is the big question.
Right. Are you just reading the text? Or are your pre-existing biases, your logic, your own philosophical assumptions, are they reading the text for you?
Oh, they almost always are, to some extent.
Exactly. So imagine trying to weigh the infinite, right? The boundless reality of the divine on the incredibly fragile, kind of shifting scales of human logic.
It's a staggering image, truly.
It really is. But, I mean, it's the exact problem we are wading into today on this deep dive. Because when we face these ancient transmitted texts, do we trust our intellect to filter them?
Or do we, submit completely to the manuscript?
Right. Do we accept the words exactly as they were handed down, even if our brains are just screaming that it doesn't make sense?
Well, it's the ultimate epistemological crisis, really. And it sits right at the absolute core of almost every major religious tradition on Earth.
Yeah, what happens when the mind and the manuscript point in opposite directions?
Exactly. So today we are opening up a really dense, highly controversial academic critique that just tears right into this tension.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a battleground between the mind and the text.
Yes. Specifically, a fiercely debated battleground within Islamic theology. The source material we're unpacking today is a critical analysis of what's called the Maturidiya school of thought.
And we really need to be clear about the lens here for you listening, right?
Absolutely. This analysis we're looking at is written from a traditionalist or Salafi perspective.
Right. And just to set the ground rules, we are not here to play referee in a centuries-old sectarian debate.
No, definitely not.
We aren't endorsing the traditionalist critique, and we aren't defending the Maturidi school either. We are simply acting as your guides to impartially unpack the arguments.
Right. Our mission is just to understand the underlying mechanics of it all.
Yeah, like how does this specific school, the Maturidis, build their foundation for deciding what's true?
And how do they run those sacred texts through the machinery of human reason?
Exactly. And crucially, why does the author of our source believe this entire methodology is fundamentally broken?
Well, to understand why the author is so heavily critical, you have to first look at how the Maturidi school maps out the very universe of knowledge.
Okay, so how do they do that? Do they just see everything as one big theology umbrella?
No, not at all. They don't view theology as a single unified landscape. They divide it into two highly distinct walled-off realms.
Two realms.
Yeah. The first realm is called akliyat. You can translate that to rationality.
Rationality, so matters governed by the intellect.
Right. And then the second realm is semiyat, which translates to transmitted matters.
For things you can only know because someone told you about them.
Exactly. Essentially divine hearsay.
Okay, rationalities and transmitted matters. Let's make that concrete for a second. What actually lives inside those two different realms?
So, according to the framework outlined in our source, the realm of rationalities, the akliyat, contains the most critical foundational aspects of the faith.
Like what?
Like God's existence, his core nature, and his fundamental attributes.
Okay, so the big stuff.
The biggest stuff. And in this space, the human intellect, the akla, is crowned as the primary judge.
The intellect blazes the trail.
Exactly. The religious text itself, the nakla, is relegated to a secondary supporting role.
Wait, really? So the text is just there to be like a cheerleader for the mind?
That's how the critique frames it, yeah.
It sounds like you use your brain to figure out who God is, and then you just open the book to find verses that say, yep, good job, you got it right.
That is precisely the traditionalist critique. The author of our source argues that making the mind the root, the asal, and the revelation, the branch, the far, it inverts the entire hierarchy of religion.
It completely flips it upside down.
Right. But let's look at the other side of the maturity map, the transmitted matters, the samiyat.
Okay, what goes in that bucket?
This bucket contains the unseen mechanics of the afterlife.
Okay.
So things like the punishment of the grave, the angels who question the dead, the physical bridge over hellfire, things like that.
I assume the logic here is that you can't just, sit in a dark room, think really hard, and logically deduce that two specific angels are going to ask you questions after you die.
That's exactly the Maturidi argument, because the mind is entirely blind to these specific unseen logistical details.
The text is allowed to be the primary authority.
Yes. In the realm of transmitted matters, the text is taken literally.
That makes sense, I guess.
And our source highlights a very revealing quote from a prominent maturity scholar named Al-Farhari to demonstrate this.
What does he say?
Al-Farhari states that texts describing the afterlife are accepted without any metaphorical interpretation simply because they are logically possible.
Okay, possible. But I sense a trapdoor here.
You'd be right.
What happens when a text talks about something the maturity mind deems logically impossible?
Then the text has to change.
Wow. Just like that.
Yeah. Al-Farhari argues that if a text suggests God has a physical direction or a form or mentions a physical attribute, like a hand.
That violates their rational framework.
Exactly. Their logic says God cannot have parts. Therefore, those texts are deemed logically impossible.
So they must be reinterpreted to mean something entirely different.
Right.
It's kind of like the relationship between a country's constitution and a Supreme Court.
Oh, that's a great analogy. How so?
Well, the holy text is the Constitution, right? But human reason is sitting on the bench as the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And the court gets to decide which clauses are taken literally like the angels in the grave, and which clauses get written off as mere metaphor because they don't align with the court's current philosophy.
That analogy hits the nail on the head.
And so the traditionalist author is basically saying you don't have the jurisdiction to rewrite the divine constitution.
Exactly. The author's central thesis is that human reason shouldn't be striking down clear clauses of divine revelation. And this setup where reason is the ultimate arbiter, it creates a massive domino effect.
Because if reason is the Supreme Court, what happens to the lower courts?
Right. What happens to the thousands of historical sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith, that deal directly with theology?
Oh, I see. Because if the mind is in charge, the historical evidence suddenly becomes a lot less powerful.
It does. And this brings us into a massive dilemma outlined in the text, which is the rejection of a specific type of historical evidence called ahadith al-ahad.
Okay, let's clarify the terminology before we get lost in the weeds here. We are talking about solitary reports versus mass transmitted reports, right?
Let's break down the mechanics of Islamic text transmission.
Sure.
At the top of the hierarchy of authenticity, you have mutawatir texts. These are mass transmitted.
Mass transmitted. What does that look like in practice?
Well, imagine 50 different journalists working for 50 different networks who have never met each other.
Okay.
And they're all reporting the exact same quote from a press conference.
Wow. Okay. So because of the sheer volume and independence of the witnesses, it is logically impossible for them to have colluded on a lie.
Exactly. The Quran itself is mutawatir.
Absolute mathematical certainty.
Yes, but then you have the ahadith al-ahad, the solitary reports.
Right.
To use your historical analogy from earlier, imagine a highly decorated, perfectly honest, 4-star general.
Okay, I'm picturing him.
And he's testifying about an order the president gave him in private. The general is trustworthy. His record is spotless.
But he was the only one in the room.
Exactly. Or maybe there were just 2 of them. The historical chain is authentic, but it relies on a very small number of people at certain links.
So it's authentic, it's trusted, but it doesn't have that overwhelming crowdsourced verification at every single stage of history.
Right. And here is where the Maturidi methodology acts as a brutal filter.
How so?
Scholars like Al-Taftazani argue that because these solitary reports rely on a few individuals, they only yield probability.
Probability.
Not certainty. Right. The Arabic term is dan. They do not yield absolute 100% certainty, which is yaqeen.
Okay, I follow the logic so far.
Therefore, the Maturidis conclude you cannot use these solitary reports to establish definitive core beliefs.
Oh, wow.
You cannot build your fundamental theology, your aqidah, on something that is only 99% certain.
But hold on. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you throw out solitary reports when it comes to belief, aren't you gutting a massive portion of the Islamic tradition?
You really are. You're discarding a vast library of prophetic tradition.
You are essentially throwing out the testimony of that highly decorated general just because he didn't have 50 other soldiers in the room to back him up.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the traditionalist author of our source mounts a fierce historical counterattack against this.
I imagine so. What's the counterattack?
The author doesn't just disagree. He views this rejection of solitary reports as an unfounded, highly dangerous innovation.
An innovation, meaning it wasn't there at the beginning.
Right. He argues it was entirely alien to the earliest Muslims. The core argument here is that the companions of the Prophet never created this artificial firewall between belief and action.
So the early Muslims didn't sit around saying, well, this hadith tells me how to wash before prayer, which is just an action, so I'll trust this single narrator.
No, they didn't do that.
But this other hadith tells me something about God's mercy, which is theology, so I'm going to need a mass crowd to verify it before I believe it.
The source insists that distinction simply did not exist.
Oh, wow.
And the author brings heavy historical artillery to prove it.
Like what? What evidence do they use?
First, the source cites Imam al-Shafi'i, who is one of the foundational legal minds in Islamic history.
Okay, a very big name.
Huge. Al-Shafi'i documented a total consensus among the early generations.
A consensus on what?
They universally accepted solitary reports for all matters of religion: law, ritual, and theology.
So there was no VIP section for theology that required a higher security clearance.
Yeah.
And if someone with the historical weight of al-Shafi'i says there was a consensus, that's a massive problem for the Maturidi argument.
It's a huge problem.
But does the source go back further than the scholars? Like, does it look at the Prophet himself?
It does. And this is where the traditionalist argument gets incredibly sharp.
Let's hear it.
The author points to the actual logistical methodology of the Prophet Muhammad. He routinely sent solitary companions out as emissaries to foreign nations.
Solitary emissaries. Just one guy?
Just one guy. The most famous example is Mu'adh bin Jabal.
Okay, where was he sent?
He was sent entirely alone to Yemen.
To teach them Islam?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what was Mu'adh's primary job? It wasn't just to teach them how to fast or pray.
Right, because they were brand new to the religion.
His first directive was to teach the people of Yemen the core beliefs of Islam. The monotheism, the aqidah.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The source argues, if a solitary report cannot establish core belief, then the Prophet's own diplomatic strategy was fundamentally flawed.
Because the people of Yemen could have just looked at Mu'adh and said, look, you seem like a nice guy, but you are a solitary report.
Right.
You only yield probability. We can't base our eternal salvation on a 99% probability. Come back when you have 50 guys with you.
It makes the Prophet's actions seem completely illogical under the Maturidi framework.
It really does. The author is saying the Prophet himself treated a solitary, trustworthy transmitter as absolute proof for theological truth.
Yes. Furthermore, the source digs into the intellectual genealogy of this rule.
Oh, this is always the fun part. Where did the Matridists get the idea to reject solitary reports in the first place?
Well, you can probably guess it wasn't from the companions of the prophet.
Definitely not. So who invented it?
The author notes this rule was originally engineered by the Mu'tazila.
The Mu'tazila. Remind us who they were.
They were the extreme, borderline heretical rationalists of early Islam.
Ah, okay. The hardcore rationalists.
Right. And the author explains why they invented it. They were heavily influenced by translated works of Greek philosophy.
Ah, Aristotle and Plato entering the chat.
Exactly. So when they encountered authentic historical sayings of the prophet that clashed with Aristotelian logic, they needed a loophole.
Because they couldn't just call the prophet a liar.
Exactly. So they attacked the transmission instead.
Oh, that's sneaky.
They invented the solitary report disqualifier simply to conveniently silence the texts that ruin their philosophical models.
So the source is basically accusing the Maturidists of quietly borrowing a Mu'tazilite trick.
That is exactly the accusation.
This is fascinating. We are really seeing how elevating the mind slowly erodes the historical text.
It does. It chips away at it piece by piece.
Which brings up a really intense thought experiment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, if the human mind in this framework is powerful enough to overrule an authentic historical hadith, just how powerful is the mind on its own? Like imagine you strip away all the texts. No Quran, no hadith, no prophets.
Okay, a blank slate.
Just a human being, a brain, and the universe.
Wow.
What happens then?
Now we are entering the debate over the obligation of the unaided mind.
The unaided mind.
Yes. What does a human being owe to God before religion even arrives on the scene?
Well, if the mind is the Supreme Court, I imagine the Maturidists think the mind can figure out the law all by itself.
They absolutely do. The source details the Maturidi belief that knowing God, recognizing his existence, and understanding his basic rights is a rational obligation.
An obligation before any text arrives.
Yes, before any divine revelation drops from the sky. The intellect alone is sufficient to bind you to this cosmic duty.
Wow.
The Maturidists argue that a person can and will be punished by God in the afterlife for failing to deduce his existence through reason alone.
Even if no prophet ever set foot in their country.
Even then...
Wait, let me make sure I understand the absolute stakes here. Let's say someone is born on a completely isolated island.
Okay, an isolated island.
They've never heard the word God.
Yeah.
They've never seen a holy book. You're saying the Maturidi view is that this person is on the hook for eternal damnation simply because they had a functioning cerebral cortex.
That is the logical conclusion of their premise.
And they failed to logically deduce a monotheistic creator from, like, looking at the palm trees in the ocean.
Yes. It is a staggering elevation of human intellect.
It really is.
They believe the evidence in the natural world is so overwhelmingly clear to a rational mind that ignorance is essentially a moral failure.
A moral failure punishable by God.
Exactly.
But human reason is wildly inconsistent.
Oh, completely.
I mean, one person sits on that island, looks at a complex ecosystem, and deduces a single brilliant designer.
Right.
But another person sits on the exact same island, watches a hurricane wipe out a village, and deduces chaos. Or a pantheon of angry, warring sea gods. Or just cold, indifferent nothingness.
Yes, the inputs are the same, but the rational outputs are completely different.
Right. Reason isn't a calculator that always outputs the same number.
And that variability of human logic is exactly why the traditionalist source completely rejects this Maturidi premise.
How do they counter it?
The author argues that making the unaided mind the ultimate arbiter of eternal salvation contradicts clear, explicit texts in the Quran.
Do they cite a specific verse?
They do. The source repeatedly points to a specific verse that acts as a theological failsafe.
Which is?
We never punish until we have sent a messenger.
Huh. We never punish until we have sent a messenger.
Yeah.
That seems pretty definitive.
It is.
God's justice requires an explicit, spoken warning before he hands down a sentence.
Yes, the traditionalist view is that divine justice is intrinsically linked to divine communication.
Because relying on human guessing isn't fair.
Exactly. Human reason might be able to suspect there is a creator, right? It might feel a sense of awe.
Sure.
But it is not a sufficient warning system to justify eternal punishment.
That makes a lot of sense.
The author points out that the Maturidi stance here is, once again, a carbon copy of the extreme rationalist Mu'tazila sect.
It's like they keep falling back into that same rationalist trap.
They really do.
It feels like if you push the maturity logic to its absolute limit, you almost don't need prophets anymore.
How do you mean?
Well, if my brain can do all the heavy lifting of figuring out God, and I can go to hell just for being bad at philosophy,
Right.
then a prophet showing up is just a helpful tutor, not a life-saving rescuer.
That is the exact philosophical tension the source highlights.
Oh, really?
Yes. If reason is robust enough to incur eternal stakes, revelation is functionally demoted.
It becomes supplementary material.
Exactly. And this absolute unyielding trust in the intellect naturally bleeds into the next major battlefield.
Which is?
Morality itself.
Oh, morality.
Right. If the mind can figure out God exists, does it also write its own moral law?
This sounds like the classic debate over objective versus subjective morality.
It is very closely related.
What are the terms the source uses for this?
The concepts are known as tasin and takbi.
Tasin and takbi.
Yes. Tasin roughly translates to making something good or perceiving it as inherently beautiful.
Okay, and taqiya?
Taqi means making something evil or perceiving it as inherently ugly.
Okay, I think I'm following.
Our source explains that the maturists believe the human intellect can independently, without any divine instruction, perceive the inherent moral value of actions.
So morality is baked into the fabric of the universe, and our brains are just like Geiger counters that can detect it.
Precisely. That's a great way to look at it.
Okay.
They argue that the mind can look at the concept of lying or betrayal and immediately grasp that it is inherently ugly.
Without needing a rule book.
Right. Conversely, the mind looks at truth-telling or justice and grasps that it is inherently beautiful.
And crucially, they believe the mind grasps this reality entirely independently.
Entirely. You do not need a holy book to tell you, thou shalt not lie.
Because the moral value is an objective fact of the universe, and reason is the tool that discovers it.
Exactly.
You know, it's the Euthyphro dilemma.
Or from Plato.
Yeah, the ancient question Plato raised. Is something morally good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it is inherently good?
Right. And the Maturidists are clearly choosing the second option.
Lying is inherently evil, and God forbids it because it's evil.
Yes.
But if it's inherently evil, we can figure that out on our own. It makes the human mind the ultimate moral compass.
It does. But let's look at how the traditionalist author navigates this.
I'm curious. Do they just say the mind is totally blind?
Actually, no. The traditionalist critique here is very nuanced.
Oh, that's surprising.
The author doesn't swing to the polar opposite extreme. He doesn't say the human mind is a completely blank slate, totally blind to morality until a prophet speaks.
Okay, so they give reason some credit.
Yes. He acknowledges that humans do have a baseline moral intuition.
Like what?
We can recognize universal goods like justice and universal evils like oppression.
So the traditionalists agree with the Maturidists up to a point.
Up to a point. The friction is over the absolute application of this rule.
Oh, I see.
To provide a balanced perspective, the source quotes the famous medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah.
What do you say about it?
Ibn Taymiyyah argued that saying morality is entirely rational or saying morality is entirely scriptural is a false dichotomy.
A false dichotomy. So both extremes lead to disaster.
Exactly.
Why is the rational extreme a disaster? If we can figure out justice on our own, isn't that a good thing?
Well, because while the mind can see the big moral mountains like murder is generally bad, it gets lost in the intricate moral valleys.
The details.
Right. Without the specific details, boundaries, and ultimate authority of the scriptural text, a purely rational moral system collapses into cultural relativism.
Cultural relativism. So everyone just makes up their own rules based on what feels right at the time.
Precisely. The source fears that if you make the mind the absolute moral compass, then whatever a specific society in a specific century deems beautiful becomes the ultimate law.
And it will inevitably be used to override the divine text. That makes total sense. Because what the human mind perceives as good or beautiful shifts radically, depending on the era.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, the rational mind of an ancient Spartan thought leaving a sick infant on a hillside to die was good for the state.
A horrifying example, but historically accurate.
Right. If the text has to bow to whatever the current intellect thinks is beautiful, the religion just becomes a mirror of the current culture.
And that observation brings us to the absolute climax of this entire epistemological war.
The climax. Okay, I'm ready.
We've seen how they handle solitary historical reports. We've seen how they view the unaided mind and how they define morality.
Right.
But all of this has been a warm-up for the main event.
What's the main event?
What happens when the definitive, mass-transmitted text of the Quran itself—
The text they cannot reject as a solitary report.
Exactly. The absolute literal word of God. What happens when that clearly states something that their reason deems impossible?
Oh, man. This is the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object.
It really is.
You have a verse in the Quran that says X, but Greek-influenced human logic says X is scientifically or philosophically impossible. Who wins?
According to our source, the Maturidists, along with the Ash'ari school, utilize what is famously known as the universal rule.
The universal rule. Sounds imposing.
This rule is their ultimate filter. The rule dictates: when a definitive textual source, like a verse of the Quran, conflicts with a definitive rational proof, the rational proof must take precedence.
Wait, I need to process that.
That's a heavy concept.
The rational proof beats the literal word of the Quran.
Yes.
How on earth do you justify that while still claiming to be a devout believer in the text?
It is a deeply fascinating piece of circular logic.
Walk me through it.
They argue that reason must be protected at all costs because reason is the very tool you use to prove the text was from God in the first place.
Oh, okay, I follow that. I used my brain to verify the book.
Right. You used your intellect to look at the miracles, weigh the evidence, and deduce that the prophet was telling the truth. So, if you suddenly encounter a verse in the book that contradicts your brain, and you decide to side with the book and admit your brain is flawed—
You just destroyed your own foundation.
Exactly. If your reason is flawed now, maybe it was flawed back when it told you the book was from God.
Wow.
Therefore, to protect the foundation of faith, reason must be treated as infallible, even if it means altering the apparent meaning of the text.
That is wild philosophical gymnastics.
It really is.
I used my flawless logic to prove this book is perfect. Therefore, if the book says something my logic disagrees with, the book must actually mean something else. Otherwise, my logic might be broken, which means the book might not be perfect.
You've captured the loop perfectly.
It's an entirely closed loop. So when they hit one of these problematic verses, they can't just cross it out with a Sharpie.
No, they still revere the text.
How do they actually process it then?
They employ one of two specific methods to sanitize the text. The first method is called ta'wil.
Ta'wil, which translates to what?
Interpretation. But it's not just casual interpretation. It is an aggressive forcing of a metaphorical meaning onto a text to make it comply with their rational boundaries.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. Why would they need to force a metaphor? What kind of verse triggers this?
A classic example involves the verses in the Quran that mention God's hand, or God's face.
Okay.
Now, we have to look at the Greek philosophy that influenced these rationalists, following the logic of Aristotle's unmoved mover.
Right, the unmoved mover.
They believed that the ultimate creator must be completely simple, meaning without parts.
Because if God has a hand, he has parts.
Yes, and if he is made of parts, he is dependent on those parts holding together.
Oh, I see.
If he is dependent on anything, he cannot be the ultimate independent God.
So the philosophical model demands a totally abstract, featureless deity.
Yes.
But the text keeps using very specific descriptive words.
Exactly. So when the Quran clearly says God has a hand, the Maturidists apply ta'wil.
They force the metaphor.
Right. They interpret the word hand metaphorically to mean power or favor or blessing.
They rewrite the dictionary definition of the word to save their philosophical model of a partless God.
That's a very accurate way to describe it.
Okay, so ta'wil is essentially acting as an aggressive editor, changing the meaning of the words. What is the second method?
The second method is called tafwid, which means delegation.
Delegation, how does that work?
This is very different. In this method, they accept the Arabic words on the page, but they claim absolute total ignorance of their meaning.
Wait, they just say they don't know what it means.
Basically, they look at the verse and essentially say, we see the word hand, we acknowledge it is in the Quran,
Right.
but only God knows what this combination of letters actually signifies. However, we know with 100% certainty that it absolutely does not mean its literal apparent meaning of a hand.
That is wild.
It's a very unique approach to text.
So ta'wil rewrites the dictionary, and tafwid just takes a black marker and redacts the dictionary completely.
Yeah, redacts it completely.
They delegate the meaning back to God, emptying the word of any comprehensible content for the human reader.
Right.
But if you constantly bend the text with tawil or empty it with halfweed, at what point does the text lose its voice?
That is the core question.
It stops being a message from God and starts being a mirror, just reflecting whatever Aristotelian logic you already brought to the table.
And that is the exact scathing critique leveled by the traditionalist author of our source.
I can imagine they wouldn't take kindly to the redaction marker.
Not at all. The author argues that this universal rule creates a profoundly crooked division.
Crooked owl.
The source accuses the rationalists of treating the sacred texts as if they are confusing, conjectural, and almost deceptive.
As if God speaks in riddles that obscure the truth.
Exactly, while simultaneously treating human, Greek-influenced philosophical deductions as if they are absolute, infallible divine laws.
That is a relentless accusation. The text has to bow to Aristotle.
It's a full-blown epistemological war. The author explicitly accuses the Maturidists of walking in the footsteps of the early Jamia sect.
The Jamia, who were they?
They were a group universally condemned by traditionalists for stripping God of all his attributes to the point of turning him into an abstract nothingness.
Ouch.
Yeah. The source argues the Maturidists are relying on imported foreign philosophy rather than the authentic prophetic tradition.
But what about Tafweed?
What do you mean?
How does the source attack the idea of just saying, only God knows what this means? On the surface, Tafweed sounds incredibly humble.
It does sound humble.
I'm just a human. I can't possibly comprehend what God means, so I'll stay silent. How can the traditionalist attack that?
Well, the rationalists actually use that defense. They claim that Tafweed was the method used by the early generations of Muslims, the Salaf.
Oh, they claim the early Muslims did this too.
Yes. They claim the companions of the Prophet just read the words without trying to understand them.
And what does the traditionalist source say to that?
The expert analysis in our source tears this defense apart.
How?
The author points out that by claiming the early generations practiced Tafweed total ignorance of meaning, the rationalists are actually deeply insulting the founders of the faith.
How is it an insult to say they were humble?
Because it portrays the companions of the Prophet as illiterate parrots.
Oh, boy.
It paints a picture of the greatest generation of Muslims reading their own holy book in their own native Arabic tongue and having absolutely no idea what it was talking about when it described the God they were worshiping.
Oh, I see. It's saying the early Muslims were walking around reciting gibberish.
Exactly.
That changes the perspective completely.
The source argues that the early Muslims understood the meanings perfectly well. They understood what the Arabic word for hand or anger or mercy meant.
So what was their approach, if not Tafweed?
The traditionalist stance is that the early Muslims affirmed the meaning of the word, but completely refused to guess the how or the physical mechanics.
Because God is unlike his creation.
Exactly. They affirmed the what without delving into the how.
Right.
The source views Tafweed, claiming the meaning itself is unknown, as a slander against the intelligence of the earliest believers.
So to boil down this massive conflict, let me try to summarize.
Go for it.
The traditionalist view is that God speaks clearly. We understand the language, we know the meaning of the words, but we don't know the physical reality behind them because God is fundamentally different from the universe.
Spot on.
The rationalist view is that God speaks in dangerous metaphors or unknowable codes, and we must either use our logic to decode them or just accept that we are completely blind to what he's actually saying.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the two opposing camps.
Thank you.
It really highlights the fundamental disagreement over the very nature of divine communication.
Yeah.
Is the text a clear guiding light, or is it a complex philosophical puzzle that requires a Greek key to solve?
I feel like we really journeyed through the labyrinth today. Let's trace our steps back.
And it's been a long path.
We've explored a deeply influential school of thought, the Maturidi, and we saw how they attempted to elevate human reason to act as the ultimate filter and judge for divine revelation.
We did.
We saw how this foundational premise, this specific epistemology, it led to a cascade of theological choices.
The huge cascade. It led to dividing religion into rational and transmitted spheres.
It led to rejecting solitary historical reports because they don't offer mathematical certainty.
It led to the profound claim that the unaided mind obligates faith before prophets even arrive.
and the belief that morality can be fully mapped by human intellect alone.
And ultimately, we saw how all of this culminated in their methodology for handling the Quran itself.
Reinterpreting or emptying sacred texts of their apparent meaning whenever they conflict with human philosophical boundaries.
And running parallel to all of this, we witnessed how fiercely traditionalist scholars push back against every single step of this methodology.
Viewing it not as a sophisticated defense of the faith, but as a dangerous systemic erosion of textual authority. It really makes you realize that reading a sacred text is never a passive activity.
Never.
It's never just about the ink on the page. It is always about the invisible glasses you are wearing when you look at that ink.
The epistemology, the rules of engagement, they determine everything.
They really do.
Yeah.
So I want to leave you listening to this with a lingering, somewhat provocative question to ponder on your own.
Okay.
It builds on everything we've unpacked today, but takes it one step further.
Let's hear it.
If human reason is established as the ultimate judge of sacred texts, whose reason exactly are we relying on? Reason is not a single, unchanging monolith floating in the sky. It is deeply human.
It changes.
It changes wildly. What was considered flawlessly rational to a 10th century philosopher reading Aristotle in Samarkand might be completely different from what is considered rational to a 21st century scientist working in New York.
Absolutely.
If the divine text must always bow to the logic of the day, does the text actually guide the human? Or does the human simply use the text as a ventriloquist dummy, continuously updating the script to endlessly echo the thoughts of their own changing mind?
A chilling and vital question.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.
Usually when you break an arm, the x-ray just shows a clean white line.
Right. It's very binary.
Exactly. It's binary and it's comforting, you know. We naturally like things to be visible, categorized, and just neatly defined by the boundaries of our own understanding.
We like boxes.
We love boxes. But what happens when you try to put the creator of the universe into an x-ray machine?
Yeah, that's where the machine breaks.
It totally breaks. So today we are opening a highly controversial theological dossier. It's a text that argues that when humans try to use ancient Greek logic to define the divine, they don't actually elevate God.
No, they accidentally delete it.
Right, they delete him from existence. It's like trying to run a massive, modern, procedurally generated 3D video game on a vintage 8-bit 2D console.
That is a great way to put it.
The human brain, our logic, our language, that is the 8-bit console. It literally lacks the dimensional capacity to render the software of an infinite God.
It just doesn't have the RAM.
Exactly. So when theologians try to force it to run anyway, the system just crashes into these wild spatial paradoxes and empty words. And that clash is what we are unpacking today.
It really is a profound epistemological problem.
Yeah.
We are stepping into this intellectual battleground that mags out the absolute limits of human comprehension.
Yeah.
But before we wade into these waters,
Yeah.
we really need to establish the exact parameters of the text we are examining for you listening today.
Ground rules. Let's do it.
Right. So the source document we're analyzing represents a very specific, very strict Orthodox theological viewpoint.
Yeah.
It's often categorized as the Salafi perspective.
Okay.
And it is a razor-sharp, systematic critique aimed squarely at the Maturidia, or the Maturidi school.
Which is a huge deal, right?
Oh, massive. It's one of the foundational theological traditions in Islamic history. But through the Orthodox lens of this specific author, the Maturidians have relied far too heavily on flawed philosophical logic.
Like the Greek stuff we mentioned.
Exactly. The author argues they've strayed from the unadulterated texts of the early generations. Now, to be unequivocally clear, for you listening, we are not taking sides here.
We are absolutely not adjudicating this theological trial.
No, we are acting entirely as neutral analysts. We're just observing the architecture of the arguments, the structural traps being set, and the historical mechanics of how these two vastly different worldviews collide.
We are mapping the battlefield, not fighting on it.
Precisely.
And to understand how this Orthodox author attacks the maturity framework, we first have to see where the Maturidists actually sit on that battlefield. Because the text doesn't just critique them in a vacuum.
No, it constructs a whole comparative map.
Right. It plots the Maturidists against another massive heavyweight in the theological landscape, which is the Ash'ari school.
Yeah, and if you want to deconstruct a group's theology, examining where they draw their lines in the sand against their closest contemporaries is highly revealing.
It really shows you what they value.
Exactly. The text uses the Ash'ari school as a sort of control group. It highlights just how extreme the maturity reliance on independent human reason truly is.
And it does this by examining this very specific, almost cinematic thought experiment, right?
Yes, the man on the mountain scenario.
I love this one. It's a classic setup. So imagine a human being born and raised on an isolated, completely inaccessible mountain peak.
Totally severed from human civilization.
Right. No prophets have ever reached them, no divine messages, no holy books, no oral traditions passing through. Just a human mind alone in nature, observing the sky, the weather, the rocks.
Just raw observation.
Exactly. Now, if this person lives their entire life and dies without ever formulating a belief in a singular creator, the core question the text poses is this isolated individual held legally and spiritually accountable in the afterlife? Like, are they punished?
It is the ultimate stress test for the jurisdictional power of the human intellect.
Yeah.
Like, does the brain have the authority to obligate divine law entirely on its own?
So how do the Ash'aris handle this?
Well, the text maps out the divergence beautifully. The Ash'aris approach this by saying, no, this individual is not punished.
Okay, why not?
Because their underlying epistemological rule is that the obligation to know God, and therefore any accountability for it, only materializes through divine revelation.
So if the formal law never reached you, you can't be penalized for failing to follow it.
Exactly. The intellect might suggest a creator is out there, but it doesn't possess the legislative authority to demand belief under threat of punishment.
You know, that tracks perfectly with how we understand modern legal frameworks. It's the fire lane analogy.
Oh, right, yeah.
Like, is it fundamentally fair to be ticketed for parking in a fire lane if there are absolutes no posted signs, no red paint, no published local ordinances? Just because a city planner assumes you should have used your common sense to deduce that emergency vehicles might need that space.
That's a great comparison.
The Ash'ari position seems to be, no posted signs, no ticket.
That is precisely the Ash'ari framework. But then the text pivots to the Maturidi position.
Which is very different.
It's a resounding yes. The man on the mountain is punished. In their paradigm, the human intellect, pure reason, is not just a passive observational tool. It is robust enough and inherently authorized to deduce the existence of God simply by observing the mechanics of the natural world.
So the intellect itself is the posted sign.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have a brain, so you should have figured out this is a fire lane.
Hold on, I'm trying to put myself in the maturity mindset here. I mean, if I look at the complexity of an ecosystem or, the mathematical precision of planetary orbits, it's not totally unreasonable to conclude there is a designer.
Sure.
But to say that this deduction is so mandatory that failing to make it carries eternal consequences without any explicit instruction, that feels incredibly heavy. That elevates the human brain to the status of a prophet.
And that right there is exactly the structural vulnerability the Orthodox author exploits in the text.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The text argues that the Ash'aris are actually correct on this specific legal point, that ultimate accountability requires the arrival of revelation.
Okay.
But the author uses this stark contrast to argue that the Maturidists have inflated the authority of the intellect to a really dangerous degree.
Because they gave it legislative power.
Precisely. By granting the mind the power to independently obligate divine law, the text claims the Maturidists aren't practicing traditional Orthodox theology anymore.
What are they practicing then?
Well, the text accuses them of mirroring an older, highly controversial, and purely rationalist sect known as the Mu'tazila.
Oh, wow. So calling them out by association.
Exactly. It's a strategic accusation meant to show that the Maturidi Foundation is philosophically compromised from the ground up.
Which brings us to an incredibly subtle but massive debate highlighted in the source. This one really caught me off guard because at first glance, it just sounds like a trivial linguistic habit.
But it's really not.
No, It actually exposes the entire psychological foundation of how these groups view human identity. It's the inshallah, the paradox, the exception in faith.
Right. The simple act of saying, I am a believer, God willing.
Yeah. It's crazy how a single conversational phrase can contain an entire universe of theological assumptions.
It really is. The text observes that the Ash'aris actually permit this phrasing. You can state your faith and append God willing to it.
But the Maturidists?
The Maturidists strictly forbid it.
And the reasoning behind that prohibition is what's so fascinating to me. The text explains that the Maturidists define faith as an absolute internal verification. It is a binary state of cognition.
Like a light switch.
Exactly like a light switch. It is either entirely on or entirely off. So if you add God willing to the statement, I am a believer, the Maturidi framework interprets that as introducing a percentage of doubt.
You are essentially saying, I think the light switch is on, maybe.
Right. And in a binary system, anything less than 100% certainty is technically disbelief.
It is a mathematical definition of faith.
Yeah.
You cannot be 99% of a believer.
But when I read the orthodox counterargument in the text, it totally shifted my perspective on this.
How so?
Well, the author points out that the earliest generations of Muslims, the Salaf, routinely used this exact phrase. They constantly said, I am a believer, God willing.
Yes, they did.
And the crucial insight here is that they weren't saying it because they doubted the existence of their own belief. It's the difference between saying, I am legally married, which is a binary status, right?
Right.
Versus saying, I am a good spouse, which is a dynamic daily action that fluctuates wildly depending on the day.
That is a highly effective way to frame it. The text outlines the orthodox definition of faith not as a static cognitive switch, but as a living composite.
Composite of what?
It comprises beliefs in the heart, words on the tongue, and physical actions. And because physical actions naturally rise and fall, I mean, some days you are deeply charitable and patient, other days you are a selfish and irritable part. Faith itself must naturally fluctuate. It increases and decreases.
So when the early Muslims said, God willing, they were expressing humility about the quality of their faith, not the actual existence of it.
Exactly.
They were saying, I hope to maintain this faith and die as a complete believer, despite my daily human failures. They viewed faith like a marriage, while the Maturidists, trapped by their rigid definitions, viewed it like a marriage certificate.
And the text leverages this perfectly by pointing out that the Maturidi logic forces them to essentially outlaw the phrasing used by the most revered foundational figures of the religion. The author paints the Maturidists as disconnected from the original organic practice of the faith.
They just look imprisoned by their own artificial binary logic.
Precisely. And if you decide that human logic is the ultimate arbiter of truth, you eventually have to build a system to process that logic.
Which brings us to the most aggressive historical claim in the text.
Yes, the intellectual DNA.
The author traces the intellectual DNA of the Maturidists and argues that they share a foundational philosophical ancestor with that older rationalist sect we mentioned earlier, the Mu'tazila.
Right.
They both rely on something called the proof of accidents and bodies.
Now, to understand the gravity of this critique, we really have to pull back and look at the broader historical landscape for a second.
Let's do it. Set the scene.
When the early Islamic Empire rapidly expanded, it absorbed territories that were deeply steeped in Hellenistic thought. Byzantine centers of learning, Syrian monasteries, these places were saturated with the works of Aristotle and Plato.
So they were swimming in Greek philosophy.
Exactly. As translations of these Greek texts flooded into the Islamic world, theologians found themselves debating Christian and Greek scholars who used a highly specific, highly technical, logical framework.
They had to learn the opponent's language to win the debate.
That's exactly what happened. And the proof of accidents and bodies is a classic Aristotelian mechanism. It was adapted to prove the existence of a creator to someone who doesn't accept scripture at all.
Let's break down the mechanics of this proof, because I have to be honest, the terminology can be incredibly opaque. In this Greek framework, what exactly is a body and what is an accident?
Okay, think of a body or a substance as an independent physical entity. A piece of iron, for example.
Okay.
It exists in three-dimensional space. Now, an accident is a characteristic, a state, or an event that occurs to that body. It cannot exist independently.
So you can't just have an accident floating around in an empty room.
Right. You cannot have heat floating around in a vacuum. Heat must be attached to a body. So if you take that piece of iron and put it in a fire, it becomes hot. It expands, it glows red. The heat, the expansion, the color red, these are accidents. They are states that change.
The iron goes from cold to hot. It goes from black to red. It changes.
Precisely. And the rationalist cosmological argument builds on this observation.
Okay, walk me through the steps.
Step 1. We observe that the universe is comprised entirely of bodies. Step 2. We observe that these bodies are inextricably bound to accidents. They are constantly moving, resting, heating, cooling, growing, or decaying.
They are always in flux.
Right. Step 3. Because they are subject to constant change, they cannot be eternal. Something eternal does not change.
Okay, I follow that.
Step 4. Because they are not eternal, they must have a point of origination. They must have a beginning. And the conclusion. Anything with a beginning requires a creator.
I mean, when you lay it out sequentially like that, it sounds airtight. It's a very elegant mathematical proof. Why does the Orthodox author of our text view this as a catastrophic theological error?
The Orthodox critique mounts a structural counteroffensive here on two fronts. First, the text argues that by making this complex, multi-tiered Aristotelian syllogism the foundational requirement for basic belief, you have essentially intellectualized faith out of the reach of the average human being.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You are telling a shepherd or a farmer that to truly know God, they must first master Greek metaphysics. The author views this as an elitist innovation that contradicts the universal accessibility of the religion.
That makes total sense. It turns salvation into a university prerequisite.
Exactly. And the second and more profound critique involves what the text calls the fitra.
Which is the innate human disposition, right?
Yes. The Orthodox view argues that human beings are fundamentally, biologically, and spiritually wired to recognize their creator. You don't deduce God through a complex equation. You recognize God through the harmony of the natural world, or the instinctual feeling of dependence during a crisis, just the basic rhythms of life. The Quranic methodology, according to the text, simply awakens this innate disposition.
It's already there.
Right. By replacing the fitra with Greek logic, the author argues the Maturidists have built their theological house on a foreign artificial foundation, and that inevitably forces them to compromise the scripture itself.
Which perfectly explains the massive epistemological collision regarding the Hadith literature. Because if your foundation is Greek logic, what happens when the historical reports of the prophet don't neatly fit into your Aristotelian categories?
You run into a major problem.
Yeah. The text highlights the maturity rule regarding ahad hadiths. Now, if we look at the transmission of historical texts, there is a massive difference in how information is verified.
It is entirely an issue of statistical probability versus absolute mathematical certainty.
Right. You have mutawatir reports, which are mass transmitted. It's like 1,000 people from 50 different countries who have never met, all writing down that they saw a comet strike the moon on a specific Tuesday.
You can't lie.
The sheer volume of independent verification makes it absolutely undeniably certain. But then you have ahad reports. These are solitary or isolated transmissions.
Now, they might be meticulously authenticated by historians. The chains of custody might be flawless. But because they rely on only one or two continuous lines of transmitters, they offer a very high degree of probability, not absolute, infallible certainty.
Okay, so the text notes that the Maturidists instituted a hard rule. You cannot use these ahad solitary reports to establish core theological beliefs.
Right. You cannot build your creed on a probability.
But the author systematically dismantles this, first by pointing out the historical hypocrisy. The text cites instances where the early scholars, including Abu Hanifa, who is literally the founder of the legal school the Maturidists revere, readily accepted these isolated reports for matters of belief.
The author strategically uses the founder against the followers. This is a very common and effective technique in these intellectual debates.
But the real turning point for me was the logical trap the author springs. Because the Maturidists actually accept these ahad reports for everyday legal rulings.
Yes, they do.
They will base their daily actions, how they pray, how they conduct commerce, on these solitary reports. Their justification is that a high probability is sufficient to mandate a physical action, but not sufficient to mandate absolute internal belief. How does the author dismantle that distinction?
The text constructs a dilemma by attacking the definition of belief itself. The author posits a simple question to the maturity framework. What exactly is belief?
It's not just a feeling, right?
No, it is not a passive void. Belief is the active internal acceptance and submission to a truth. It is, in the terminology of the text, the action of the heart.
The action of the heart. Wow, that completely reframes the argument.
It completely collapses the maturity distinction. The author argues that if a highly probable, rigorously authenticated report reaches you detailing a specific characteristic of God or a reality of the unseen, the required response is to actively hold that belief internally.
You have to act on it with your heart.
Exactly. If solitary reports are sufficient to mandate the actions of the physical limbs, like the mechanics of prayer, then by their own internal logic, they must be sufficient to mandate the actions of the heart.
So they're contradicting themselves.
The text claims that by rejecting them, the Maturidists are not being intellectually rigorous. They are just arbitrarily filtering out any prophetic traditions that threaten their preconceived philosophical rules.
Okay, if the Maturidists are willing to filter out massive swaths of historical reports because they don't meet this rigid logical threshold, what happens when they hit the absolute bedrock.
The Quran itself.
Right. What do they do with the massive, undeniable texts, the Quran itself, or the mass-transmitted reports that explicitly describe God in ways that violate their Aristotelian rules about bodies and accidents?
This is where the concept of tafweed comes in.
Yes. And it is arguably the most intense battleground in the source material.
It is the ultimate crisis of reading. I mean, how do you engage with a text that your own logical framework tells you cannot possibly mean what it appears to say?
Exactly. Let's use an analogy here. Imagine you are a highly trained lawyer and you are handed a binding legal contract. The only problem is the contract is written entirely in ancient Sumerian.
Okay.
Now, maybe take a phonetic class, you learn how to pronounce the symbols, you can stand up in a courtroom and read the contract aloud flawlessly, but you have absolutely zero semantic understanding of the words you are saying.
The words are entirely empty vessels to you.
Right. The text explains that the Maturidis claim the earliest, most pious generations of Muslims, the Salaf, treated verses in the Quran describing God's attributes exactly like this Sumerian contract.
The Maturidis argue that when the early Muslims encountered verses stating that God ascends or has hands or gets angry, they practiced tafweed.
Meaning they just read the sounds.
Right. They affirmed the phonetic pronunciation of the Arabic words, but they believed the semantic meaning was entirely unknown to human beings. They delegated the meaning back to God.
And the Orthodox author's reaction to this claim is just visceral. The text argues that claiming the early Muslims practiced this kind of empty reading is actually a devastating insult to the intelligence and piety of those foundational generations.
The critique is severe. The author argues that this implies the earliest generations treated the revelation, a text explicitly sent down to clarify reality and guide human understanding, as a collection of incomprehensible riddles.
Which defeats the purpose of a revelation.
Exactly. The Orthodox position asserts that God does not communicate in semantic voids. The text was revealed in clear, functional Arabic, precisely so the linguistic meaning could be understood by the people receiving it.
To solidify this, the text brings in a legendary historical quote from Imam Malik. He's one of the foundational giants of early Islamic scholarship.
Yes, a massive figure.
People came to Imam Malik and asked him to explain a verse that states God ascended, or istiwa, over the throne. His response is treated as the golden rule in this Orthodox text. Imam Malik said, "The ascension is known, the how is unknown."
Let's analyze the mechanics of that statement because it is the linchpin of the Orthodox argument against tafweed. The ascension is known.
Right.
The text points out that this explicitly proves the early Muslims engaged with the semantic meaning of the words. They did not empty the vocabulary. They knew what the verb to ascend meant in the Arabic lexicon.
They didn't treat it like ancient Sumerian. They understood the dictionary definition. What they delegated to God was the how, the mechanics of it. It's like when physicists talk about quantum gravity. I know what gravity is linguistically. The concept is known. But how it functions at a subatomic level, the actual mechanics of a graviton particle.
That is completely unknown to you.
Completely unknown, and frankly, beyond my current comprehension. But my ignorance of the mechanics doesn't mean I empty the word gravity of its meaning.
That is an excellent modern parallel. The author argues that the early Muslims affirmed the real linguistic definitions of the attributes. God truly hears, truly sees, truly ascends.
But with a boundary.
Right. They maintained a strict boundary regarding the modality. How those attributes exist in an infinite being is fundamentally unlike human mechanics and impossible to conceptualize.
So they understood the what, but not the how.
Precisely. The text essentially accuses the Maturidists of fabricating the concept of tafweed, this empty reading, as a historical fiction. It was a retroactive attempt to legitimize their need to dodge explicit texts that threaten the delicate logical framework they have built.
Because if the Maturidists admit that the early Muslims understood the real meaning of these words, they are trapped. They would have to accept those meanings too, and their entire system of bodies and accidents just shatters.
It all comes falling down.
So if they refuse to accept the literal meanings and the Orthodox author won't let them hide behind empty words, what is the Maturidi alternative?
This is where the deep dive gets genuinely surreal.
It really does. We are moving from the philosophy of reading into the ontology of space. We are entering the geometry of the divine.
Because when you systematically strip away every physical or spatial descriptor from an entity, you are eventually forced to define exactly what is left.
The text outlines the Maturidi spatial description of God. In an attempt to avoid comparing God to anything physical, they state that God is, quote, not inside the universe, not outside the universe, not connected to the universe, not disconnected from it, not above it, and not below it.
It is an absolute exhaustive negation of all spatial reality and relational existence.
My brain just hits a processing error trying to render that image. I mean, how do you even picture that?
You can't. And the Orthodox author points out that this is exactly the problem. The text argues that this exhaustive list of negations is the precise, literal dictionary definition of something that is madum.
Madum, what does that mean?
It is the Arabic term for completely non-existent.
Wow.
The argument is that you cannot strip an entity of all spatial, directional, and relational properties without reducing it from a real existing being into a purely abstract void.
It highlights the danger of extreme negative theology. If I define a car by saying it possesses no engine, no wheels, takes up zero physical space, and exists in no location relative to the universe, I am no longer describing a vehicle.
You were describing the absence of one.
Right. And the text notes a fascinating historical consequence of this. It points out that even later, deeply committed rationalist scholars from within these very schools eventually recognize this fatal flaw.
They had to confess that this description of God is completely impossible for the human mind to actually conceptualize.
And the text says they compared their own theological description to the universal concept of a human. Let's unpack that philosophical tangent. What does that actually mean?
This touches on classical ontology. Consider the concept of humanity. Does the universal form of humanity walk into a coffee shop and order an espresso?
No. Specific instantiated humans do. John, Sarah, or Michael walks into the shop.
Exactly. Humanity as a universal concept only exists internally, as an abstract categorization within the human mind. It has no external, physical, independent reality outside of the brain.
So it's just an idea.
Right. And the author argues that by systematically stripping God of all directional and relational reality, the Maturadists have inadvertently committed a colossal ontological error. They have reduced God from a living, acting, independent entity into a universal concept that only exists in the theater of the imagination.
They've intellectualized the divine into a cognitive ghost.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
Hold on, though. I'm starting to feel a bit of sympathy for the Maturadists here. If I put myself in their shoes, I'd be absolutely terrified of accidentally describing God as, like, a giant physical being sitting in the sky like Zeus on Mount Olympus.
Sure, the fear of anthropomorphism is real.
Right. Aren't they just performing these extreme intellectual gymnastics out of a desire to be respectful? They are aiming for tenzi, absolute purification of the divine concept.
The author of the text doesn't deny their underlying intention. The text actually acknowledges the drive for tanzi.
Yeah.
However, the author argues that the methodology employed to achieve this purification completely violates the fitra.
That innate human disposition we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The text asks a very profound behavioral question. When human beings are in moments of absolute desperate distress, regardless of their culture, their era, or their theological training, when they instinctively cry out to a higher power, where do their eyes and hands naturally go?
They look up. It's a universal reflex. You raise your hands toward the sky.
Precisely. The Orthodox argument is that this global, instinctual reflex to look upward is not a collective geographical misunderstanding.
What is it then?
It is a built-in, divinely programmed biological and spiritual disposition, recognizing that the Creator is above creation. To intellectually mandate that God is not above is to declare war on the most primal human instinct.
And the text brings the hammer down by citing Abu Hanifa again.
Yes.
The author quotes him as explicitly stating that anyone who says they don't know if God is in the heaven or on the earth has committed an act of disbelief. It's a devastating rhetorical move, essentially saying, your philosophical gymnastics aimed at protecting God have ironically led you to a position that the founder of your own legal tradition considered heretical.
The text continually uses these historical anchors to portray the Maturidi spatial paradox, not just as a logical failure, but as a severe deviation from established Orthodox tradition.
So, if the geometry of space collapses under this logic, the text then shifts to the matrix of language itself. If the Maturidists insist God is nowhere and lacks all physical-sounding attributes, how do they engage with the specific vocabulary of the Quran?
Because the text uses words like hands or face or speech.
Right. And the answer, according to the text, is through heavy, systematic metaphors. The technical term used is tawil.
And in the context of this Orthodox critique, Tawil is not viewed as a harmless literary device. It is viewed as an aggressive theological weapon used to rewrite the text.
Let's examine the attribute of hands. The Quran explicitly mentions God's hands. The text maps out the maturity reaction. Their Aristotelian logic alarms sound immediately right. They think bodies have hands are made of parts. God is not a body and has no parts. Therefore, the word hand absolutely cannot mean hand.
So what do?
They deploy tawil and interpret the word to mean power or blessing or favor. Now, in everyday English, this makes sense. If I say the hand of the king, I am implying the king's power or authority. It seems pretty harmless.
But the author's critique is that applying this conversational metaphor to the divine attributes results in tatil.
Tatil.
Yes. This is a critical term in the document, meaning the total stripping, emptying, or nullification of the attribute itself.
The text cites early scholars who warned that translating hand to power is the language of severe innovation. And the logic behind this warning is really fascinating to me. The argument is essentially about authorial intent.
How so?
Well, God possesses a vast vocabulary. If God merely wanted to communicate the concept of power, he could have easily used the specific Arabic word for power, but he deliberately chose to reveal the word hand.
Right.
By forcefully changing the word to align with human logical constraints, the author argues you aren't protecting the concept of God. You are auditing him. You are deleting a unique attribute he chose to reveal.
The orthodox mechanism requires affirming the word hand as a real semantic attribute, but instantly applying the caveat that it is a hand unlike human hands.
Safely avoiding physical comparison without deleting the vocabulary.
Exactly. The text argues that the Maturidi reliance on metaphor essentially erases the revealed text under the guise of interpreting it.
Which sets the stage for what I found to be the most intellectually intense section of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
The matrix of the voice of God. The incident at the burning bush.
Oh, this is where theology, history, and incredibly dense Arabic grammar violently collide.
The debate over the nature of divine speech is one of the most contentious in all of Islamic history, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Let's establish the narrative baseline. Moses is in the desert. He approaches the burning bush. The Quran states with absolute clarity that God spoke to Moses. But the text explains that the Maturidis face a catastrophic logical problem here.
Because of their rules about change.
Right. Speaking, in our standard understanding, involves acoustic sounds, phonetic letters, sequential syllables, and time. One word must follow another. And in their Aristotelian framework, anything that happens in a sequence, anything that involves time and change, is an accident.
And God cannot be subject to changing accidents.
So if God's speech cannot consist of sequential sounds or letters, they must construct an entirely new mechanical explanation for what occurred at the burning bush.
The text outlines their solution, which is a concept called kalam nafsi.
Translating roughly to inner speech or speech of the self.
Right. The Maturidists define God's true speech as this silent, internal, eternal state of meaning. It contains no letters, no acoustic sounds, no sequence, no beginning, and no end. It is simply an internal presence of meaning within the divine self.
Which naturally raises the question, if God's speech is a silent, eternal state, what exactly hit the eardrums of Moses in the desert?
According to the maturity framework detailed in the text, Moses did not actually hear the uncreated eternal voice of God.
What did he hear then?
Instead, they posit that God created a physical acoustic sound, literal sound waves, that emanated from the tree itself. This created sound acted as a translation or a representation of that silent eternal meaning.
So Moses heard a created sound, not God speaking directly.
And it is here that the author of the text deploys their most devastating counteroffensive. They don't just argue philosophical theology, they pivot to highly technical linguistics, utilizing master Arabic grammarians to dismantle the maturity position.
Wait, let me look at this grammar argument because it is brilliant. The text brings in heavyweights like Al-Farra and Thalab, who analyze the specific phrasing the Quran uses to describe this event. The phrase is, Kalama Allahu Musa takliman,
which translates to, God spoke to Moses with direct speech.
What is the mechanical function of that last word, takliman?
Takliman is the masdar.
The masdar.
The verbal noun, derived directly from the primary verb kalama, to speak. The text dives into the foundational rules of classical Arabic grammar here. It explains that when a sentence pairs a verb with its own verbal noun for the purpose of emphasis, it absolutely, unequivocally obliterates any possibility of interpreting the action as a metaphor.
Okay, let me try to map this onto English. It's like if I said, I literally physically spoke to him. If I use those emphatic qualifiers, I permanently lock the meaning into reality.
Right, you close off any other interpretation.
I cannot come back a week later and claim, oh, I was speaking metaphorically, I actually just sent him an email, or I just mentally projected thoughts in his direction. The grammatical structure I used destroys my ability to claim metaphor.
That is precisely the function of the masdar in this Arabic construction. It removes all linguistic wiggle room. The text argues that by explicitly stating, Kalama Allahu Musa Takliman, the Arabic language inherently demands that a real, direct, literal verbal action occurred.
Wow.
To claim that Moses merely heard a created acoustic anomaly emanating from a piece of wood and not the direct speech of God is not just a theological stretch. It is a fundamental violation of the Arabic language.
The text uses this grammatical law to just completely trap the Maturidis. It argues that their concept of kalam nafsi, this silent, soundless inner meaning, is just bad Arabic.
The author portrays the Maturidi position as a desperate, reverse-engineered attempt to force the texts of the Quran to comply with ancient Greek rules about accidents and change.
They are willing to break the foundational rules of grammar to protect their philosophical scaffolding.
The author sees it as prioritizing Aristotle over the structural integrity of the revelation itself.
We have covered an immense amount of intellectual territory today. Let's pull back and survey the battlefield we've mapped out through the lens of this orthodox critique.
It's a vast landscape.
It really is. We've explored a deeply analytical, highly systematic intellectual conflict over how humanity attempts to define the absolute. On one side of the text narrative, we have the Maturidis, a school that, according to the author, has tethered its theology to complex Greek-style rationalism.
Yes.
In their noble pursuit to purify the concept of God and protect him from physical comparison, they deploy heavy linguistic metaphors, they define the divine through exhaustive spatial negations, and they reconstruct the concept of speech into a silent, abstract state.
And on the opposing side, we have the author's strict orthodox counteroffensive. The text argues that this obsessive attempt to over-intellectualize God results in his conceptual erasure.
The Madu.
Exactly. By defining God as spatially nowhere and nullifying his revealed attributes through metaphor, the orthodox critique claims the Maturidis have whittled the creator down to a non-existent, abstract, universal concept. The author's central thesis is that we must subordinate our logic to the literal grammatical reality of the revealed texts.
And trust our innate human disposition, our fitra, over complex, imported philosophical equations.
It is a profound clash between the jurisdictional limits of human reason and the supremacy of direct revelation.
And as we conclude our neutral observation of this text, I think there is a crucial underlying theme for you, the listener, to consider. We spent a lot of time analyzing grammar, definitions, and spatial geometry today. But beneath all of this lies a massive question about the ultimate capacity of human language.
This ancient theological battle is, at its core, a debate about epistemology and communication.
The 8-bit console trying to run the infinite software.
Precisely. If an infinite, absolute being truly exists, could our finite human language, a system of grunts and symbols invented by mortals to describe rocks, trees, and tribal politics, could it ever genuinely possess the dimensional capacity to describe that infinite reality accurately?
It's a huge question.
Or is our language, our very vocabulary and syntax, so inextricably anchored to the physical world that the moment we attempt to describe the divine, we are inherently forced into the realm of metaphor? And if we are indeed trapped in a metaphorical matrix, who holds the ultimate authority to dictate which metaphors reveal the truth and which ones delete the divine entirely?
Does the logic of the human brain guide our understanding of the text? Or does the text dictate the limits of our logic? We are right back to the broken X-ray machine. When you are trying to diagnose the ultimate reality, you can't just point to a glowing white line and say, there it is. You have to make a foundational choice about what you trust more, the diagnostic machine of your own intellect, or the reality of the light shining through it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of theology, the boundaries of language, and the ancient struggle to define the divine. Keep examining the foundations of the arguments around you, keep questioning the mechanics of what you read, and we will see you on the next deep dive.